What would you do if the person who ruined your life was secretly helping you survive? For Marcus Reed, blindness was a prison sentence, the end of a brilliant career in architecture, and the beginning of a decade of darkness, both literal and figurative. What he never suspected was that Eleanor Winters, the woman he'd spent years battling in design competitions, pitch meetings, and industry gossip columns, was silently paying his mortgage every month. Eleanor, who had surged to the top of the architectural world while he languished in obscurity. Eleanor, who had been arguing with him just hours before the accident that stole his sight. Eleanor, who had incorporated his innovative design elements into her award-winning buildings, while he couldn't even draw a straight line anymore. For 10 years, this secret arrangement continued, until an unexpected bank error revealed everything. Now, faced with the truth, Marcus must confront the question that burns brighter than any light his eyes will ever see again. Which is the greater betrayal? Eleanor's anonymous charity that kept him afloat, or the fact that she built her empire by adapting his visionary ideas while he sat in darkness? And what happens when your greatest rival turns out to be both your secret benefactor and the only person who truly understands your creative soul? Sometimes our fiercest competitors see something in us that we can't see in ourselves, even when we can see nothing at all. The first time Marcus Reed realized he would never see again, he wasn't thinking about the darkness. He was thinking about lines, clean, precise lines that had once flowed from his pencil onto drafting paper. Sweeping curves that defined the signature style that had made him one of the most sought-after young architects in Boston. The silhouette of the Thompson Cultural Center, his crowning achievement, a building that seemed to defy gravity, with cantilevered sections that extended impossibly into space while maintaining perfect structural integrity. Lines he would never draw again. The optic nerve damage is irreversible, the doctor had said, her voice clinically detached yet tinged with sympathy. I'm sorry, Mr. Reed. Marcus sat now by the window of his hospital room, face turned toward a warmth he could feel but a light he could not see. It had been 3 weeks since the accident. 3 weeks of specialists and second opinions, all arriving at the same devastating conclusion. 3 weeks since headlights had burst through his windshield, the last visual memory he would ever possess. His phone rang for what must have been the 100th time that day. Without looking, a darkly ironic thought, he knew who it was. Miranda, his assistant, desperately trying to hold his practice together. Or perhaps one of the clients whose projects now sat in limbo. The Westwood Museum expansion, the Franklin Residential Tower, projects worth millions, now indefinitely paused. He ignored the call. You should answer that, a nurse said, entering his room. People care about you. People care about what I could do for them, Marcus replied, his voice flat, and that person no longer exists. Self-pity doesn't suit you, Mr. Reed, she responded, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency. Especially not someone who created that beautiful building downtown, the one that looks like waves frozen in glass. The Henshaw corporate headquarters. That's the one. My sister works there. Says it's like being inside a sculpture. Marcus turned his face away. That building was a compromise, Eleanor Winters got the commission I should have won. My design was superior. The nurse made a non-committal sound. Well, I wouldn't know about that. But I do know there's a woman who's been in the waiting room every day this week, asking to. Sayu says her name is Eleanor. Marcus stiffened. Tell her I'm not receiving visitors. She looks pretty determined. I don't care if she's moved into the waiting room permanently. I especially don't want to see her. The cruel irony of his words hung in the air between them. He would never see Eleanor Winters again, never see her face when he outbid her for a project. Never see the subtle tightening around her eyes when he pointed out the structural flaws in her designs during industry panels. Never see anything at all. The nurse finished her work in silence, the soft beeping of machines the only sound punctuating the room. As she turned to leave, Marcus spoke again. Wait, did she say why she's here? Just that she needs to speak with you, and that she's sorry. Marcus laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. Eleanor Winters doesn't do sorry. She does calculated. She does strategic. Everything is a competition to her. Maybe near-death experiences change perspectives, the nurse offered. Should I tell her you'll see her tomorrow? Marcus turned his face back toward the window, toward the light he could feel but not see. No, he said finally. Tell her I said she won. Game over. She can go collect her trophy. As the door closed behind the nurse, Marcus reached for his phone, knocking it to the floor in the process. The simple action, once, so automatic, now a frustrating reminder of his new limitations. In the darkness that had become his world, he could almost picture Eleanor's expression upon receiving his message. The slight lift of her eyebrow, the calculating look as she assessed whether his withdrawal from the field was genuine or merely tactical. What he couldn't have imagined was that in less than 24 hours, Eleanor Winters would be sitting in her sleek downtown office, making a call that would inexorably link their lives for the next decade, a secret arrangement that would remain hidden until a single clerical error brought everything to light, and by then nothing would ever be the same. 10 years later, Marcus Reed's fingers moved deftly across the surface of his kitchen table, navigating by touch alone. The coffee mug was exactly 12 inches from the edge, where he always placed the morning paper, delivered daily despite his inability to read it, sat folded to his right, a habit he couldn't break. His world was meticulously organized, every object in its predetermined place. Routine was salvation when you lived in darkness. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," came a cheerful voice as his front door opened. "Dreary weather today, raining cats and dogs out there." "Good morning, Harriet," Marcus replied, not turning his head toward his twice-weekly housekeeper. "Coffee's already brewed." "Bless you," Harriet said, the sound of her raincoat being hung up, followed by footsteps moving toward the kitchen. "Any plans for today?" Marcus smiled wryly. Same as yesterday and the day before that. His days had taken on a monotonous rhythm since the accident. Morning exercises, audiobooks, occasional visits from the few friends who hadn't drifted away. Weekly sessions with his therapist, who continued to encourage him to reconnect with his passion for architecture through other means. "For you could teach," she would suggest. "Consult. Your knowledge didn't disappear with your sight." But Marcus couldn't bear it, being adjacent to the world he once dominated, reduced to commenting on others' creations rather than building his own. Better to make a clean break. So instead, he spent his days in this spacious Beacon Hill townhouse that had once represented success, but now felt more like a mausoleum, a shrine to the man he used to be. The mortgage payments were substantial, but somehow they always got paid. His disability insurance and savings had stretched remarkably far, though he never quite understood the financial mathematics of it all. His accountant assured him everything was in order, and Marcus had long ago stopped asking detailed questions. "Mail's here," Harriet announced, placing several envelopes on the table. "Want me to read them to you?" "Just tell me if there's anything." "Besides bills or charity solicitations, let's see. Bill advertisement, something from your bank that looks important." "Read that one," Marcus interrupted, suddenly alert. Harriet opened the envelope, the sound of paper tearing unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. "It's about your mortgage," she said after a moment. "Something about a payment processing error." Marcus frowned. "What kind of error?" "It says, oh my, it says your mortgage has been receiving dual payments for nearly 10 years. Your regular automatic withdrawal and another payment from, the second account holder's name is redacted in this copy. But it says the system error has been fixed, and future payments will only be processed from your account unless you make other arrangements." Marcus sat perfectly still, his coffee forgotten. "That's not possible. It says you can contact Mr. Gonzalez at the number provided for clarification." "Give me my phone," Marcus said, his voice tight. 10 minutes and one increasingly tense phone conversation later, Marcus sat in stunned silence. "Mr. Reed?" The bank representative's voice came through the speaker. "Are you still there?" "Yes," Marcus managed. "You're absolutely certain about this?" "Yes, sir. For approximately 10 years, your mortgage has been paid twice each month, once from your account, and once from an account established by Ms. Eleanor Winters. The duplicate payments were applied to your principal, which is why your outstanding balance is significantly lower than it would typically be at this point in your mortgage term. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Eleanor Winters. After ending the call, Marcus sat motionless at his kitchen table, mind racing. Why would Eleanor Winters, of all people, be secretly paying his mortgage? The woman who had been his fiercest professional rival, the woman who had soared to international acclaim while he faded into obscurity, the woman whose argument with him hours before his accident had sent him driving angry into the rain-slicked night. "Mr. Reed?" Harriet's concerned voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you all right?" "Harriet," Marcus said slowly, "I need you to help me with something. I need to find Eleanor Winters." "The architect?" Harriet sounded surprised. "The one who designed that twisty building downtown, the one they featured in the Globe last month." "That's her," Marcus confirmed, his jaw tight. "We have unfinished business." What Marcus couldn't articulate, even to himself, was the hurricane of emotions this revelation had unleashed. Shock, confusion, humiliation, and beneath it all, a burning question that demanded an answer. Was this charity, pity, guilt, or something else entirely? For 10 years, he had lived with the belief that Eleanor Winters had simply moved on, collecting the success that might have been his. Now he discovered she had been silently present in his life all along, an invisible benefactor whose motives remained obscure. And he intended to uncover the truth, even if what he found shattered the careful equilibrium he had built in his world of darkness. The headquarters of Winters Design Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek glass tower in downtown Boston, a building that Eleanor herself had designed naturally. Smooth surfaces, precisely angled light, and an open central atrium that created a sense of expansiveness and possibility. It was, architectural critics had noted, a space that seemed to breathe with creative energy. Eleanor stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her private office, gazing out at the city skyline she had helped reshape over the past decade. At 45, she had achieved everything she once dreamed of: international recognition, a thriving firm with offices in 3 countries, and a portfolio of landmark projects that would outlive her by centuries. And yet, "Ms. Winters," her assistant's voice came through the intercom, "your 3 o'clock is here." Eleanor turned from the window, straightening her impeccably tailored charcoal suit. "Send them in." She had been expecting the Johansson Group representatives to discuss their proposed hotel development. Instead, when the door opened, a different figure appeared, tall, lean, with silver threading through once dark hair. He moved with careful precision, one hand gripping the arm of Eleanor's assistant, the other holding a white cane. Marcus Reed. Eleanor froze, completely unprepared for this ghost from her past to materialize in her carefully controlled domain. "Mr. Reed insisted on seeing you," her assistant explained, clearly uncomfortable. "He said it couldn't wait." "It's fine, David," Eleanor managed, finding her voice. "Please show Mr. Reed to a seat." As David guided Marcus to one of the sleek chairs facing Eleanor's desk, she frantically assessed the situation. The bank. It had to be. After 10 years of flawless execution, a simple clerical error had exposed everything. Once seated, Marcus dismissed the assistant with a nod. When the door closed, leaving them alone, a heavy silence descended. "It's been a long time, Eleanor," Marcus finally said. 10 years, 2 months, and 17 days, Eleanor replied automatically, then winced at her precision. A ghost of a smile touched Marcus's lips. "Still counting the days since my exit from the field? I'm flattered." "I didn't mean," Eleanor began, then stopped. "How have you been, Marcus?" "Let's not pretend this is a social call," he said, his voice hardening. "I think you know why I'm here." Eleanor sank into her chair, suddenly grateful that Marcus couldn't see her expression. "The bank contacted you?" "Yes." Another silence, stretched between them, taut with unspoken questions. "Why?" Marcus finally asked, the single word heavy with a decade of confusion. Eleanor had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times over the years, imagining how she would explain if her secret was ever discovered. Yet now, facing the reality of Marcus sitting before her, all her prepared justifications evaporated. "It's complicated," she said, Uncomplicate it. His knuckles whitened around the handle of his cane. Eleanor took a deep breath. After your accident, after you withdrew from practice, I felt responsible. Because we argued that night. Partially, she admitted. But also because what? Because the world of architecture needed your voice, Marcus. Even if you couldn't practice anymore. I never wanted you to worry about basic survival. I thought if your essential needs were covered, perhaps eventually you'd find a way back to design. Teaching, consulting, something. Marcus leaned forward, his sightless eyes somehow finding her with unerring accuracy. That's very noble, Eleanor, almost believable, except for one thing. What's that? The Thompson Cultural Center expansion, the Westwood Museum, the Harrington Residential Complex. Do those projects sound familiar? Eleanor's mouth went dry. They were commissions you had secured before your accident. Projects I had to abandon, Marcus corrected. Projects that mysteriously ended up in your portfolio afterward, with designs that incorporated elements remarkably similar to my preliminary sketches. I can explain. I bet you can, Marcus cut her off. You've had 10 years to craft the perfect explanation. Tell me, was paying my mortgage a way to ease your conscience while you built your reputation on my innovations? A form of compensation for intellectual property you appropriated? The accusation hung between them, sharp and precise as one of Marcus's former technical drawings. Eleanor flinched as if physically struck. That's not fair, she said quietly. No? Then enlighten me. Eleanor rose from her desk and moved to a cabinet along the wall. She removed a thick portfolio and returned, placing it on the desk between them with a substantial thud. What is that? Marcus asked, hearing the sound. Every project of mine that incorporated elements of your design philosophy, Eleanor said, along with detailed accounting of the profits from each project. And this. She placed a smaller folder atop the larger one. This contains records of every payment I've made toward your mortgage over the past decade, she continued. If you had someone compare the two, you'd find they match almost exactly. Marcus sat still, processing this information. You've been paying my mortgage with profits from projects built on my ideas. Yes. Why the secrecy? Why not just offer me a consulting fee or credit? Eleanor laughed, a small, bitter sound. Would you have accepted it? The great Marcus Reed taking charity from his rival. We'll never know, will we? You made that decision for me. I did, Eleanor acknowledged. And perhaps that was wrong, but at the time, after seeing you in that hospital after you sent me away, I didn't know what else to do. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and honest in a way their professional relationship had never been. All those years we competed, Marcus said slowly. I never really knew you at all, did I? Nor I you, Eleanor replied. We were too busy trying to beat each other to actually see each other. Marcus's fingers drummed against his cane, a nervous habit Eleanor had never noticed in their previous life. So, what happens now? That's up to you, Eleanor said. If you want me to stop the payments, I will. If you want public acknowledgement, to have your influence on my work, I'm prepared to give it. If you want financial compensation beyond what I've provided, we can discuss terms. Marcus shook his head. What I want, he said carefully, is to understand. Not just the what, but the why. 10 years is a long time to maintain a secret, Eleanor. This wasn't just about guilt or compensation. There's something you're still not telling me. Eleanor looked at the man sitting across from her, the rival who had pushed her to excel, whose absence had left a strange void in her professional life, even as her success soared. A complex emotion she couldn't quite name twisted in her chest. You're right, she admitted. There is more. But I don't think either of us is ready for that conversation yet. Marcus nodded slowly. Then perhaps we should meet again, when we're both more prepared for honesty. As he rose to leave, Eleanor fought the urge to help him, knowing it would be unwelcome. Instead, she walked to the door and opened it, the sound guiding him. Eleanor, he said, pausing at the threshold, our argument that night, and I never blamed you for the accident. That was all on me. I know, she said softly. But I blamed myself anyway. After he left, Eleanor returned to the window, watching as Marcus emerged from the building far below, white cane sweeping confidently before him. For 10 years, she had kept him at a distance while simultaneously keeping him close, an arrangement that had somehow satisfied a need she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. Now everything had changed. The truth was emerging, bit by bit, and Eleanor wasn't certain either of them was prepared for where it might lead. Marcus sat in his living room, fingers tracing the edges of the documents Eleanor had sent home with him. His assistant, Jeremy, hired specifically to help with this investigation, had spent hours reading everything aloud, from the mortgage payment records to the detailed project portfolios. "It's all here," Jeremy said, amazement evident in his voice. "Every payment matches profits from projects that incorporated your design elements. She's been, I don't know what to call it, paying royalties, making amends. The accounting is meticulous." Marcus leaned back in his chair, trying to process this information. "Read me the project descriptions again, the ones that supposedly contain my influence." Jeremy picked up the portfolio. "The Westwood Museum expansion. Cantilevered exhibition spaces create a sense of suspension between earth and sky, a technique pioneered by Marcus Reed in his early conceptual work. The interplay of natural light through strategically placed skylights reflects Reed's philosophy that illumination should guide the visitor's journey." She actually wrote that? My name is in these documents? "In all of them," Jeremy confirmed. "Each project entry explicitly credits elements of your design philosophy or techniques. There are even side-by-side comparisons of her final designs, with sketches labeled as Reed Original Concepts." Marcus rubbed his temples, a headache beginning to form. This makes no sense. Eleanor Winters was the most competitive, driven architect I've ever known. We spent years trying to outdo each other, and now you're telling me she's been essentially sharing credit with me in her private files, while simultaneously becoming the toast of the architectural world. "It seems that way," Jeremy said, "though these acknowledgements never made it into any public materials. It's like what? Like she was keeping a record for herself, or for you if you ever found out." Marcus stood and moved carefully to the window, placing his hand against the cool glass. Outside, rain fell on Boston, a sensation he could hear but no longer see. The soft patter against the window pane matched the confusion drumming through his mind. "Call her," he said suddenly. "Tell her I want to meet again, not at her office. Somewhere neutral." 2 days later, they sat across from each other at a quiet corner table in a small cafe in Cambridge. The establishment was nearly empty in the late afternoon lull, affording them privacy for the conversation ahead. "Thank you for meeting me," Marcus said after their coffee had been served. "Of course," Eleanor replied. "Have you reviewed the materials?" "Yes, my assistant read everything to me." Marcus wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "I'm still processing it all." "I understand." "Do you?" Marcus leaned forward. "Because I'm not sure I do. You've spent a decade paying my mortgage with money earned from projects that were influenced by my work, while keeping detailed records that acknowledge that influence. Records no one else has ever seen." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "It sounds bizarre when you say it aloud." "It is bizarre, Eleanor. What I can't figure out is why. Why maintain this secret connection all these years? Professional guilt doesn't explain the longevity or the meticulous documentation." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the ambient sounds of the cafe, gentle music, the hiss of the espresso machine, murmured conversations at distant tables. "The night of your accident," Eleanor finally said, her voice low. "We were arguing about the Thompson Center design. I remember. You accused me of playing it safe, of technical precision without vision." Marcus nodded slightly. "You accused me of prioritizing aesthetic ambition over practical function." "We were both right," Eleanor said. "That was always our dynamic. You pushed boundaries, I ensured structural integrity. You dreamed, I executed. We saw ourselves as rivals, but in reality, we were complementary," Marcus finished. "Exactly. After your accident, when I took over those projects you had to abandon, I realized I couldn't do them justice without incorporating your perspective. Your voice was missing from the architectural conversation, so I tried to channel it." You could have approached me directly. I tried, in the hospital. You sent me away. Marcus sighed, remembering. I was in a dark place, literally and figuratively. Understandably so, Eleanor acknowledged, but as time passed and your name faded from industry discussions, I felt an increasing responsibility to preserve your influence. The mortgage payments started as guilt, yes, but they evolved into something else, a recognition that I was benefiting from your vision and you deserved compensation, even if I never knew about it. Perhaps especially then, Eleanor admitted, it wasn't about public recognition. It was about balance, private justice. Marcus took a sip of his coffee, considering her words. That still doesn't explain the documentation, the side-by-side comparisons, the explicit credits in your internal files. Eleanor hesitated, then spoke softly. Those were for me, a reminder. Of what? That I wasn't as self-sufficient as I pretended to be, that my success wasn't entirely my own, that the rivalry that once defined us had transformed into a strange kind of partnership. You, the silent influencer whose ideas continued to shape my work. Me, the practical executor who could bring those ideas to physical form. A partnership where one partner was completely unaware, Marcus pointed out. That's not usually how collaborations work. No, Eleanor agreed, it isn't. They sat in silence again, the weight of 10 years of unspoken connection hanging between them. So what now? Marcus finally asked. Now that I know everything, what happens next? Eleanor took a deep breath. That depends on what you want. As I said before, I'm prepared to make this right however you see fit. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. I've been thinking about that, about what making it right might actually look like. And I think, Marcus paused as if surprised by his own thoughts, I think I want to work with you, officially. Eleanor's coffee cup clattered against its saucer. What? You've been incorporating my design philosophy into your work for a decade. I've been sitting in darkness, my knowledge and expertise going unused. Perhaps it's time we acknowledged what seems to have been true all along, that we're better together than apart. You want to come work for my firm? Eleanor asked, disbelief evident in her voice. Not for with, Marcus clarified. A true collaboration this time, one where both parties are aware of the arrangement. But how would that even... I don't know yet, Marcus admitted. We'd have to figure it out, but I'm tired of the darkness, Eleanor. Not just the physical darkness, the creative darkness. For 10 years, I've been cut off from the work that defined me. Meanwhile, you've been carrying a piece of me forward without my knowledge. Maybe it's time we both stepped into the light. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Eleanor was silent for so long that Marcus began to worry she had somehow left without him hearing. Eleanor? I'm here, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'm just processing. This is the last thing I expected when you discovered the payments. What did you expect? Anger? A lawsuit? Public humiliation? Honestly? Yes. All of those would have made more sense than this. Marcus smiled slightly. 10 years ago, that would have been my reaction, but a decade of blindness teaches you perspective. Holding on to anger is its own kind of darkness. So you're serious about this? A collaboration? I am, Marcus confirmed, though I have no idea what form it would take. I can't exactly review blueprints or sketches anymore. No, Eleanor agreed, but architecture isn't just visual. It's conceptual, philosophical. You always understood the human experience of space better than I did. The possibility hung between them, tentative, fragile, but real. I'll need to think about this, Eleanor said finally. It would require restructuring how my firm operates, creating new processes. Of course, Marcus nodded. Think about it, but know that I'm serious. For the first time in 10 years, I feel awake, like maybe there's a future for me in this field after all. As they parted ways outside the cafe, Eleanor paused. Marcus, there's something else you should know. What's that? The Thompson Cultural Center expansion. Your design, the one we argued about that night, I built it, exactly as you conceived it. It won the National Design Award 3 years ago. Marcus stood perfectly still, absorbing this information. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't know how, Eleanor admitted. But if we're going to move forward together, it seemed important that you know. As Marcus made his way home, tapping his cane along familiar paths, his mind buzzed with possibilities he had long ago abandoned. For a decade, he had lived in a world defined by what he had lost. Now, unexpectedly, he found himself contemplating what might still be possible, a collaboration with Eleanor Winters, his greatest rival, his secret benefactor, and perhaps if they could navigate this strange new territory, his pathway back to the world he had never truly left behind. The conference room at Winters Design. Associates fell silent as Eleanor finished speaking. Around the table, her senior team exchanged glances, some confused, others openly skeptical. "Let me make sure I understand," said Richard Torres, her chief operating officer. "You want to bring Marcus Reed on as what exactly? A consulting partner?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, standing at the head of the table with confident posture that belied her internal nervousness. His title would be Creative Design Partner. "The Marcus Reed?" asked Sophia Chen, a brilliant young architect who had joined the firm 2 years earlier. "The one who designed the original Thompson Center?" "The same. But he's been out of the field for a decade," objected Paul Winters, Eleanor's cousin and the firm's financial director. "And he's blind. How exactly would this work?" Eleanor had anticipated this question. "We would need to develop new processes, adapt our methods of collaboration and presentation. At significant cost and disruption," Paul pointed out. "Yes," Eleanor acknowledged. "Initially, there would be challenges, but I believe the creative benefits would far outweigh them." The team continued to raise concerns, practical, financial, logistical. Eleanor addressed each one with careful consideration, neither dismissing their worries nor allowing them to derail her resolve. Throughout the discussion, she couldn't help but reflect on how strange it felt to be advocating for Marcus Reed, the man she had once considered her greatest professional threat. After the meeting, Richard lingered behind. "You didn't tell them the whole story," he observed once they were alone. Eleanor sighed. Richard had been with her since the beginning and was one of the few people who knew about the mortgage payments. "No," she admitted. "They don't need to know everything yet. They'll find out eventually, especially if he becomes part of the firm. By then, I hope his contributions will speak for themselves." Richard studied her with the keen perception that made him invaluable as her second in command. "This isn't just about professional collaboration, is it?" Eleanor turned away, organizing papers that didn't need organizing. "I don't know what you mean." "Eleanor, I've known you for 15 years. I was there during your rivalry with Marcus. I saw what his accident did to you. It was a professional loss to the field," she said stiffly. "It was more than that," Richard countered gently. "You once told me, after too much champagne at the Pritzker ceremony, that competing with Marcus, Reed made you better. That without him pushing you, success felt hollow." Eleanor remained silent, unable to deny his words. "Just be careful," Richard advised. "Bringing him into the firm changes everything. Your dynamic, your authority, the company culture. Make sure you're doing it for the right reasons." As Richard left, Eleanor moved to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. Was she doing this for the right reasons? The question had haunted her since Marcus proposed the collaboration. Was it guilt? Certainly, that had motivated the initial mortgage payments. Was it professional respect? Absolutely. Marcus's talent had been undeniable, his vision unmatched. Was it a desire for redemption? Perhaps. But there was something else too, something she wasn't ready to name even to herself. Across town, Marcus faced his own challenges. He sat in his living room, while Jeremy read aloud from architectural journals featuring Eleanor's work over the past decade. The Winters approach combines rigorous structural innovation with humanitarian sensibility, Jeremy read. Her buildings don't merely occupy space, they engage in dialogue with their surroundings and the people who inhabit them. Marcus smiled, faintly. That doesn't sound like the Eleanor I knew. She was brilliant, certainly, but her early work was more concerned with technical perfection than human experience. According to this profile, her design philosophy evolved significantly after 2015, Jeremy continued. Critics noted a new dimension to her work, a balance between pragmatism and vision that transformed her from a merely excellent architect into a truly revolutionary one. 2 years after his accident, the time frame wasn't lost on Marcus. "Does it mention any influences on this evolution?" he asked. "Not directly," Jeremy replied, though there is a quote from her, "Great architecture is never created in isolation. We are all products of dialogue, even when that dialogue happens internally." Marcus leaned back in his chair, contemplating this cryptic statement. Had Eleanor been carrying on an internal dialogue with him all these years, imagining his critiques, incorporating his perspective? The idea was simultaneously flattering and unsettling. "What about practical considerations?" he asked, changing the subject. "If I'm going to work with her firm, I need to understand how to contribute meaningfully despite my limitations." Jeremy set aside the journal. "I've been researching that. There are technologies designed for visually impaired architects, 3D tactile models, audio description software, haptic feedback systems. With the right tools, you could review and contribute to designs through touch and sound rather than sight. At considerable expense," Marcus noted. "Yes," Jeremy agreed, "though for a firm of Winter's size it would be manageable, and would require her entire team to adapt their workflows around my needs. Also, yes." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "Maybe this is a mistake. Even if Eleanor is willing, asking an entire organization to transform their processes for one person seems excessive." "If I may," Jeremy said carefully, "I've spent the past few days reading about your work. Before. And it seems to me, that excessive was rather your specialty. The Thompson Center was considered physically impossible until you proved otherwise. The Harrington complex redefined urban residential space. You built a career on pushing boundaries." "That was different," Marcus objected. "Those were design innovations, not accommodations for disability." "Are they really so different?" Jeremy challenged. "Both require rethinking established methods. Both demand creative problem-solving. Both have the potential to open new possibilities, not just for you, but for the field as a whole." Marcus fell silent, considering. "Besides," Jeremy added, "from what I've read about Eleanor Winters, she doesn't seem like someone who would propose this collaboration unless she believed it was worth the challenge." That evening, Eleanor called Marcus to share her team's reaction and discuss next steps. The conversation was tentative, professional, yet undergirded by an awareness of all that remained unresolved between them. "My team has concerns," she admitted, "valid ones." "As do I," Marcus replied. "This won't be easy, Eleanor." "No," she agreed, "but I think it's worth trying." They discussed practical arrangements, how often Marcus would come to the office, what technologies might facilitate his participation, which current projects might benefit most from his input. "There's a competition," Eleanor said toward the end of the call, "for the rehabilitation of the Blackwood Warehouse District. The brief calls for preserving historical elements while creating modern, accessible urban spaces. It seemed appropriate. For a test run of our collaboration," Marcus finished her thought. "Exactly. Low stakes, but meaningful work." "When is the submission deadline?" 8 weeks from now." Marcus considered this timeline. "That's ambitious." "We don't have to win," Eleanor said quickly. "This is about establishing whether we can work together effectively, not—" "Eleanor," Marcus interrupted, a hint of his old competitive fire in his voice, "if we're doing this, we're doing it to win." The silence that followed carried a charge. Eleanor hadn't felt in years, the electric spark of creative challenge, of minds preparing to engage not as rivals, but as allies. "Of course we are," she said finally, and Marcus could hear the smile in her voice. As they ended the call, both felt a strange mixture of apprehension and anticipation. They were venturing into uncharted territory, former rivals turned reluctant, collaborators, bound by a decade of secret connection neither fully understood. The coming weeks would test not only their professional compatibility, but the foundation of trust they were attempting to build upon years of competition, secrecy, and absence. Marcus set down his phone and moved to his desk, fingers finding the raised elements of a tactile city map he kept there. For 10 years, he had navigated a world of darkness by creating mental maps of his surroundings, learning to rely on senses beyond sight. Now he faced a new challenge, finding his way back into the world of architecture, a world he had once navigated with ease, but which would now require new pathways, new methods, new forms of perception. And his guide would be Eleanor Winters, the woman whose career had flourished in his absence, whose success had been built partially upon his influence, and whose motives remained as complex and layered as one of her architectural masterpieces. The irony wasn't lost on him, the blind man following the rival he once refused to acknowledge as an equal. But perhaps, he thought as his fingers traced the contours of the map, they would find their way together. The first collaborative session between Marcus and Eleanor took place in a specially prepared room at Winters Design Associates. The space had been cleared of unnecessary furniture, leaving a large central table embedded with a tactile modeling system, a revolutionary technology that could transform digital designs into raised surfaces that Marcus could explore with his hands. Eleanor watched as Marcus ran his fingertips across the surface, a look of concentration on his face, as he read the scale model of the Blackwood Warehouse district. The main thoroughfare runs northwest to southeast, he observed, tracing the path. And these larger structures along the eastern edge, the original textile warehouses, Eleanor confirmed. Built in 1892, brick construction with cast iron details. They're protected by historical preservation statutes. Marcus nodded, continuing his exploration. What's this circular element here? A fountain, currently non-functional. The city wants it restored as a central feature. For 2 hours they worked this way, Marcus exploring the site model through touch, Eleanor providing context and background. Occasionally, other team members would join them, initially awkward in their interactions with Marcus, but gradually becoming more comfortable as they observed his sharp insights and quick understanding. The challenge, Marcus said as their session was winding down, is connecting the historical identity with contemporary function. These buildings were designed for industrial efficiency, not human comfort or community engagement. Exactly, Eleanor agreed. The preservation requirements limit our options for structural changes, particularly to the facades. But the interiors? More flexibility there. Though still some protected elements, Marcus's fingers continued to move across the model, as if his hands were seeing possibilities his eyes could not. What if we invert the traditional approach? Instead of adapting historical structures to modern needs, what if we design modern elements that deliberately contrast with and complement the historical ones? Eleanor leaned forward, intrigued. Go on. These warehouses were built to contain, to enclose and protect goods. What if our intervention is about opening, revealing, connecting? Glass and steel insertions that create transparency where there was opacity, pathways that flow through buildings rather than terminating at them. As Marcus spoke, Eleanor could almost see the design taking shape, the juxtaposition of old and new, contained and open, private and public. It was a concept that honored the site's history while transforming its purpose. That's brilliant, she said, genuine admiration in her voice. Marcus smiled slightly. It's just a starting point, but a compelling one. As the team dispersed, Eleanor stayed behind, watching as Marcus carefully memorized the room's layout, his cane tapping discreetly to mark the path to the door. Was this helpful? She asked. The tactile system, I mean. Incredibly so, Marcus confirmed, though it takes some getting used to. Interpreting three-dimensional space through touch utilizes different neural pathways than visual processing. We could modify it if there are adjustments that would make it more effective for you. Marcus paused, seeming surprised by the offer. I'll think about that. Thank you. They established a routine over the following weeks. 3 days at the office, where Marcus would work with the team on the Blackwood project. The other days, Eleanor would visit Marcus's home, where they would continue their discussions, in the comfortable environment he knew best. It was during these home sessions that their collaboration began to deepen, moving beyond professional courtesy into something more substantive. "You've changed your design approach," Marcus observed one afternoon as they sat in his living room, discussing Eleanor's portfolio. "Your early work was primarily concerned with structural innovation, pushing materials to their limits, but these later projects, they're more invested in how spaces feel, how people move through them." Eleanor, seated across from him, was momentarily taken aback by his perception. "How would you know that? You haven't seen my recent work." "No," Marcus agreed, "but I've heard the descriptions, the reviews, and I remember your earlier priorities vividly. We argued about them often enough." Eleanor smiled at the memory. "You used to call me technically brilliant but humanly oblivious. And you called me conceptually ambitious but practically irresponsible," Marcus countered, a matching smile appearing on his face. "We were both right," Eleanor admitted, "and both wrong." "So what changed?" Marcus asked. "What shifted your focus from pure structure to human experience?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "Your accident," she finally said. "Watching you navigate the hospital that day, a space that was functionally efficient but emotionally sterile, it made me think about how environments impact people, especially people with different needs and perceptions. So I became your case study in inclusive design?" Marcus's tone was light, but a certain tension underlined the question. "Not exactly," Eleanor said carefully. "More like a catalyst for questioning my assumptions about architecture, about accessibility, about many things." Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "That's quite an influence for someone who was supposedly out of your life." "You were never really out of my life, Marcus," Eleanor said quietly. "That's becoming increasingly clear." The admission hung between them, neither fully comfortable with its implications. "Tell me about the Thompson Center," Marcus said abruptly, changing the subject. "You said you built it according to my original design. How did that work?" Eleanor welcomed the shift to more professional territory. "I had your preliminary sketches and concept notes from before the accident. The structural calculations needed refinement, but the vision was entirely yours. And you executed it without modification. That doesn't sound like the Eleanor Winters I knew." Not without modification," she conceded, "but with tremendous respect for your intent. The cantilevered observation deck, the light wells, the acoustic engineering, all as you envisioned. Where I made changes, they were to resolve technical issues, not to alter the essential experience." "I wish I could see it," Marcus said softly. Eleanor hesitated, then reached for her bag. "I brought something. It's experimental, but it might help." She placed a small device on the table between them. "It's called a sonic sight. It translates visual data into audio information, not just descriptions, but spatial rendering through sound." "I've heard of these," Marcus said, reaching for the device. "The technology is still developing." "Yes, this is a prototype from a firm we've worked with. They're specifically developing applications for architecture and spatial design." Eleanor moved closer, guiding his hands to the controls. "I loaded it with a comprehensive scan of the Thompson Center, interior and exterior." Marcus positioned the device and activated it, placing the specialized headphones over his ears. For several minutes, he sat in complete stillness, his expression shifting subtly as the audio rendering created a spatial map in his mind. When he finally removed the headphones, his face held an emotion Eleanor couldn't quite decipher. "Is it accurate?" she asked hesitantly. "It's my building," Marcus said, his voice thick with feeling. "Different from how I would see it visually, but unmistakably the space I designed. The proportions, the progression, the relationship between elements. You really built it as I intended." "Yes. Why?" The question was direct, cutting through the professional distance they had maintained. "You could have modified it beyond recognition, claimed it as your own. No one would have known. I certainly wouldn't have." Eleanor met his sightless gaze, answering with equal directness, though he couldn't see her expression. "Because it deserved to exist as you conceived it. Because your vision was better than any adaptation I could have created. Because..." She paused, searching for words. Because some debts can't be paid with money alone. The honesty of her response seemed to surprise them both. In that moment, something shifted between them, the careful professional boundary they had established, giving way to a more complex acknowledgement of their intertwined history. "Bring it again next time," Marcus said, gesturing to the sonic sight device. "And bring scans of your work too. I want to understand how your approach has evolved." When Eleanor left that evening, both felt the subtle change in their dynamic. They were no longer merely former rivals negotiating a new professional relationship. They were two architects, beginning to recognize in each other something they had both been missing. A perspective that complemented their own, a voice that challenged and enhanced their thinking. The Blackwood project was progressing rapidly. Their concept of historical containment juxtaposed with modern openness resonating with the entire design team. But alongside the professional collaboration, another connection was forming. One, built on a decade of unconscious influence, secret support and newfound respect. Neither was ready to name it yet. Neither was certain where it might lead. But both recognized that the structures they were building extended beyond architectural designs to the foundation of a relationship unlike any they had known before. "It won't work," Marcus said firmly, his fingers tracing the latest iteration of the Blackwood model. "The transition from the Eastern Warehouse to the Central Plaza is too abrupt. There's no dialogue between the spaces." The design team exchanged glances across the conference table. After 6 weeks of collaboration, they had grown accustomed to Marcus's direct criticism, but this particular aspect of the design had been Eleanor's contribution. "The contrast is intentional," Eleanor explained, her voice level despite her frustration. "The sudden shift from enclosed industrial space to open public area creates a moment of revelation for visitors." "It creates disorientation," Marcus countered, "and not the productive kind. The spatial narrative needs connective tissue, elements that prepare the visitor for the transition." "Such as?" Marcus's hands moved again across the model, this time more purposefully. "A graduated series of openings in the warehouse wall, increasing transparency as you approach the threshold. Perhaps a canopy element that begins inside the building and extends into the plaza, creating continuity overhead while the floor plane changes." As he spoke, Eleanor could visualize the solution and recognized its superiority to her original concept. The realization brought mixed emotions, professional admiration coupled with a twinge of the competitive instinct that had defined their earlier relationship. "That would require significant modification to a protected facade," she pointed out. "Not if we work within the existing window openings," Marcus replied. "The structural bays already provide a rhythm we can amplify." The exchange continued, their different perspectives circling toward a resolution that neither had envisioned individually. Around them, the design team watched with growing appreciation for the dynamic unfolding before them. Two brilliant minds, once rivals, now engaged in a creative dialogue that elevated rather than diminished each other's contributions. Later, as they reviewed the revised transition design, Eleanor found herself studying Marcus's face. After weeks of collaboration, she had begun to read his expressions with new understanding. The slight furrow between his brows when he was processing spatial information, the subtle lift at the corner of his mouth when a solution clicked into place. "You're staring," Marcus said, suddenly startling her. "How could you possibly know that?" He smiled. "Your breathing changes and you stop moving papers or clicking your pen. You become very still when you're observing something intently." "I didn't realize I was so transparent," Eleanor said, somewhat disconcerted by his perception. "We've been working closely for weeks now," Marcus shrugged. "I've learned to read people differently since losing my sight. Small sounds, breathing patterns, subtle shifts in position. They create a different kind of picture." Eleanor considered this. "So you're still seeing, just through different means." "In a way," Marcus agreed. "Though it's not the same, more like a translation, from one sensory language to another." "Is that what architecture has become for you? A translation?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, but it's more complex than that. I'm not just converting visual information to tactile or auditory. I'm learning to conceptualize space in fundamentally different ways." "How so?" When I could see, I thought primarily in terms of visual impact, how light played across surfaces, how forms created visual rhythm, how sight lines guided experience. Now, I think more about how spaces feel, how acoustics shape perception, how textures and temperatures create boundaries and transitions. Eleanor leaned forward, fascinated. That's extraordinary, Marcus. It's a completely different framework for architectural thinking. Not completely different, he corrected, more like expanded, and in some ways, more honest. Architecture has always been multisensory, but the visual aspect tended to dominate our consideration. At least it dominated mine. And mine, Eleanor acknowledged, in my early work especially. As their conversation deepened, Eleanor felt a growing awareness of how profoundly Marcus's perspective was influencing her thinking. His insights weren't merely additive to her design process. They were transformative, challenging fundamental assumptions she hadn't even recognized she held. The realization both excited and unsettled her. For years, she had unconsciously incorporated elements of his approach into her work, filtering his innovation through her practical lens. Now collaborating directly, the exchange was immediate, dynamic, and far more potent. This shift in perspective extended beyond their professional collaboration. As the competition deadline approached, they began working longer hours, often, ending the day with informal discussions over takeout meals. During these less structured interactions, their conversation would occasionally drift from architecture to more personal territory. "Did you ever marry?" Marcus asked one evening as they sat in his living room, architectural models temporarily set aside. The question caught Eleanor off guard. "No," she answered. "There were relationships, but nothing that lasted. The firm always came first." "I remember that about you," Marcus said. "The absolute dedication. We had that in common." "What about you after the accident?" "There was someone," Marcus admitted. "Lisa. She was a physical therapist I met during rehabilitation. We were together for almost 3 years." "What happened?" Marcus smiled faintly. "She wanted more than I could give. She saw blindness as something to be overcome, a challenge we would face together. I saw it as a fundamental redefinition of who I was. Neither perspective was wrong exactly, but they weren't compatible in the long run." Eleanor nodded, then realized the gesture was lost on him. "I understand that. The incompatibility of perspectives, even when both have validity. Like our old arguments about form versus function?" "Exactly like that." They were quiet for a moment, both reflecting on the parallels between their professional disagreements and personal choices. "I used to think we were fundamentally opposed," Eleanor said finally, "that your approach and mine couldn't coexist within the same design philosophy. And now I'm beginning to think we were always two halves of a more complete vision. Your conceptual ambition balanced by my technical precision, my practical focus enhanced by your human empathy." Marcus turned toward her, voice, his expression reflective. "It's an interesting theory, that we needed each other professionally even while competing." "More than interesting," Eleanor said. "I think it explains a lot about the past decade, about why I felt compelled to maintain a connection to you, even if it was secret and one-sided, and about why I agreed to this collaboration despite the complications," Marcus added. "Perhaps some part of me recognized that my work had always been in dialogue with yours, even in opposition." As the evening deepened into night, their conversation continued to explore this new understanding, not just of architecture, but of the intricate relationship that had shaped both their careers. When Eleanor eventually rose to leave, she paused, making a decision. "The competition presentation is in 2 weeks. I'd like you to be there." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "At the actual presentation?" "Eleanor, I'm not sure that's necessary," she interrupted. "Maybe not, but it is right. This design reflects your vision as much as mine. More, in some aspects. You should be present when it's evaluated. The jury might see my presence as unusual. A blind architect presenting a visual design." "Let them," Eleanor said with sudden fierceness. "It's time the industry reconsidered what architectural vision actually means. Who better to challenge their assumptions than the man who designed the Thompson Center? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You've changed, Eleanor." "Have I?" The Eleanor I knew would never have risked a competitive advantage for a principal. She smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Perhaps I've learned something from our collaboration too." As she left, Eleanor realized with striking clarity how profoundly her perspective had shifted. For years she had carried Marcus's influence as a private burden, a debt to be repaid, a voice to be preserved. Now she found herself wanting to publicly acknowledge his contribution, to share rather than claim credit. It was more than a professional courtesy. It was a recognition that the work they were creating together transcended individual achievement, that their combined vision was more valuable than either of their separate perspectives. And beneath that professional recognition lay something more personal, a growing awareness that the connection between them had never been merely about architecture, that perhaps the rivalry that had once defined their relationship had been masking a deeper complementarity, one that extended beyond design principles to the core of how they each perceived the world. For the first time in her career, Eleanor found herself more invested in the integrity of the collaboration than in her own professional advancement. It was a perspective shift as fundamental as the one Marcus had described in his approach to architecture. After losing his sight, a translation from one way of seeing to another, more complex and ultimately more truthful understanding. The Winters design associate's office buzzed with nervous energy. In 48 hours, they would present their Blackwood Warehouse District proposal to the competition jury, a panel of distinguished architects, urban planners, and city officials. The design had evolved into something remarkable, a harmonious interplay between historical preservation and contemporary innovation, between visual impact and multi-sensory experience. Eleanor stood before the assembled team, running through final presentation logistics. "The jury will have 30 minutes to review our materials before we present. Marcus and I will lead the presentation, with Richard handling the technical specifications and Sophia addressing the sustainability elements." Paul, Eleanor's cousin and financial director, raised his hand. "About that, have we considered how Marcus's participation might be perceived?" A tense silence fell over the room. "What exactly do you mean, Paul?" Eleanor asked, her voice carefully neutral. Paul shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just concerned that having a visually impaired presenter might distract from the design itself. The jury might focus on the unusual circumstance rather than our proposal." Before Eleanor could respond, Marcus spoke from where he sat at the conference table. "It's a fair concern," he said calmly. "The jury might indeed be distracted, initially. But that distraction could work to our advantage." All eyes turned to him. "How so?" Paul asked. "Because it directly reinforces our central design principle," Marcus explained. "Our entire concept revolves around experiencing space beyond the merely visual, embracing the tactile, the acoustic, the kinesthetic aspects of architecture. Having a blind architect present a design that prioritizes multi-sensory experience isn't a liability. It's the most powerful demonstration of our approach we could possibly offer." The room remained silent as the team processed this perspective. Finally, Sophia, the young architect who had been working closely with Marcus on the project, spoke up. "He's right," she said firmly. "And furthermore, Marcus's insights have been fundamental to the design's evolution. His presence isn't symbolic, it's essential to explaining the proposal's success." The tension in the room dissipated as murmurs of agreement spread among the team. Even Paul nodded reluctantly, acknowledging the logic. Eleanor observed this exchange with a complex mixture of emotions: pride in Marcus's graceful handling of the objection, gratitude for Sophia's support, but also a gnawing discomfort that she hadn't been the first to defend him, that she had paused, however briefly, before countering Paul's concern. After the meeting, she found Marcus in his office, a space that had been carefully designed to accommodate his needs, with tactile markers on important surfaces and a sophisticated computer system that translated visual information into audio and haptic feedback. "That was well handled," she said, closing the door behind her. Marcus looked up from the tactile model he was exploring. Paul wasn't wrong to voice the concern. Better to address it directly than have it simmer beneath the surface. Still, I should have been the one to respond immediately. Why? Because you're the firm's leader? Or because you feel responsible for me in some way? The directness of the question caught Eleanor off guard. I don't feel responsible for you, Marcus. Don't you? He challenged gently. Isn't that what the mortgage payments were ultimately about? Taking responsibility for what happened to me? Eleanor fell silent, unable to deny the truth in his assessment. The problem with responsibility, Marcus continued, is that it creates imbalance. If you're responsible for me, then I'm dependent on you. Is that really the dynamic you want for our collaboration? Of course not, Eleanor said quickly, but you can't deny there's an unusual history between us. No, I can't, Marcus agreed, and that history has shaped both our lives in ways we're still discovering. But if this partnership is going to work, professionally and personally, we need to move beyond guilt and obligation. What do you mean by personally? Eleanor asked, focusing on the word that had caught her attention. Marcus turned toward her, his expression unreadable. I think you know what I mean, Eleanor. These past 2 months we've spent more time together than most married couples. We've shared ideas, histories, perspectives. We've created something neither of us could have developed alone. That's the nature of professional collaboration, Eleanor said, though she knew even as she spoke that the explanation was insufficient. Is it? Marcus asked. Is that all this is to you? The question hung between them, demanding a level of honesty Eleanor wasn't certain she was prepared to offer. Before she could formulate a response, her phone chimed with an incoming message. It's Richard, she said, reading the screen. There's an issue with the presentation materials. Go, Marcus said, turning back to his model. We can continue this conversation later. Eleanor hesitated, aware that she was being offered an exit from a difficult moment, uncertain whether she should take it or push through the discomfort. Later, she promised, and left to address the crisis. The issue proved to be significant, a problem with the digital rendering files that threatened to derail their carefully planned presentation. For hours, Eleanor worked with the technical team to resolve it. The unfinished conversation with Marcus pushed to the background by the immediate emergency. It was late evening by the time everything was back on track. Most of the team had gone home, but light still spilled from Marcus's office. Eleanor paused outside his door, considering whether to knock or leave him to his work. Before she could decide, her phone rang. The screen displayed a name that sent a chill through her. James Henderson, chairman of the competition jury. James, she answered, trying to keep her voice casual. This is unexpected. Eleanor, Henderson's voice was grave. I'm calling as a professional courtesy. I have received some concerning information that I felt you should be aware of before the presentation. Eleanor moved away from Marcus's door, lowering her voice. What kind of information? An anonymous source has provided the jury with documentation suggesting that your firm has been appropriating design concepts without proper attribution, specifically concepts originally developed by Marcus Reed before his accident. Eleanor's stomach dropped. The detailed records she had kept, the side-by-side comparisons, the explicit acknowledgements of Marcus's influence, someone had obtained them and forwarded them to the jury. James, I can explain. I should hope. So, Henderson interrupted, because these materials raise serious ethical questions about your practice, questions that could impact not just this competition, but your firm's reputation more broadly. Marcus Reed is now collaborating with our firm, Eleanor said quickly. He's fully involved in the Blackwood project and will be presenting with me. It's a very recent development, as I understand it, Henderson replied skeptically. Convenient timing, some might say. It's more complicated than that. I'm sure it is. And you'll have an opportunity to address these complications after the regular presentation. The jury will require a private session with you and Mr. Reed to discuss these allegations. After ending the call, Eleanor stood motionless in the hallway, her mind racing. Who could have leaked those files? They had been secured in her private server, accessible only to her and Richard, her trusted second-in-command, who had expressed concerns about bringing Marcus into the firm, who had warned her that the full story would eventually come out. Before she could process this possibility, Marcus's office door opened. He stood in the doorway, his expression troubled. "Who was that on the phone, Eleanor? You heard?" "Not clearly, but enough to know something's wrong. Your voice changes when you're upset." Eleanor sighed. There was no point in hiding the situation. "James Henderson, head of the competition jury. Someone sent them documentation about my use of your design concepts over the years." Marcus stilled. "The records you kept? The ones you showed me?" "Yes." "Who would have access to those?" "Very few people," Eleanor said, the implication hanging between them. "And now the jury knows about our arrangement." "They know part of it," Eleanor corrected. "They know I incorporated your ideas into my work. They don't know about the mortgage payments." "Yet," Marcus said grimly. "Marcus, I'm sorry. This complicates everything, especially the presentation." "It does more than complicate it, Eleanor. It fundamentally changes the narrative. Instead of presenting as innovative collaborators, we'll be perceived as a guilty party and her victim-turned-partner." The assessment was blunt but accurate. Everything they had built over the past 2 months, the genuine creative partnership, the evolving design philosophy, the personal connection, was now overshadowed by the revelation of Eleanor's years of unattributed borrowing. "What do we do?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than just the competition presentation. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "We could withdraw from the competition. Cite technical issues with the presentation materials. Running away won't solve the underlying problem." "No," he agreed. "But it would buy us time to prepare a more measured response, to figure out who leaked those files and why." Eleanor shook her head. "Withdrawing would look like an admission of guilt. The rumors would spread without our counter-narrative. We need to face this directly." "And what exactly is our counter-narrative, Eleanor?" Marcus asked, a new edge in his voice. "That you paid my mortgage for a decade with profits from projects influenced by my ideas, without my knowledge or consent. Out of what? Guilt? Pity? Some convoluted sense of professional duty?" The harshness of his tone startled her. "I thought we had moved past this. I thought you understood why I did what I did." "Understanding isn't the same as approving," Marcus countered, "and understanding in private is very different from defending those actions to a jury of our peers." The tension between them, which had been gradually dissolving over weeks of collaboration, suddenly reasserted itself with new intensity. The progress they had made toward a balanced partnership seemed to evaporate, replaced by the old dynamic of rival versus rival, each defending their professional integrity. "So, we're back to being adversaries," Eleanor said, unable to keep the hurt from her voice. Marcus's expression softened slightly. "No, but we're facing a significant challenge, and pretending otherwise won't help either of us. Someone deliberately leaked those files to undermine our presentation. We need to understand why. And in the meantime, we prepare for the worst. We develop a presentation that addresses these allegations head-on. We tell the truth, not just about the professional borrowing, but about the entire complicated history between us." "Including the mortgage payments?" "Especially the mortgage payments," Marcus confirmed, "because that's the part that transforms this from a story about intellectual appropriation to one about something else entirely." "And what is that something else, Marcus?" Eleanor asked, echoing their earlier interrupted conversation. "What would you call it?" Marcus turned his face toward her, his expression unreadable in the dim hallway light. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I think presenting to that jury might force both of us to figure it out." As they stood there, the weight of the coming confrontation settling between them, Eleanor realized that the complication they faced was more than a professional challenge. It was forcing a reckoning with their shared history, with the unacknowledged connection that had bound them together for a decade, and with emotions neither had been prepared to name. The competition presentation, which had been intended to showcase their collaborative vision, would now become something far more revealing, a public examination of a relationship that defied simple categorization and a test of whether the foundation they had built could withstand exposure to the harsh light of professional scrutiny. The presentation room hummed with tension. The jury members sat in a semicircle, their expressions carefully neutral as Eleanor and Marcus stood before them. Behind them, a large screen displayed the Blackwood Warehouse District proposal, a design that harmoniously blended historical preservation with innovative public spaces, that engaged all senses rather than prioritizing only the visual experience. Under normal circumstances, the presentation would have focused exclusively on the merits of this design, but these were not normal circumstances. "Before we begin our formal presentation," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil, "I would like to address the documentation you received regarding my firm's work and its relationship to concepts originated by Marcus Reed." The jury members exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her direct approach. "The materials you received are authentic," she continued. "For the past decade, I have maintained detailed records acknowledging where my designs incorporated elements first conceptualized by Marcus. What those records don't explain, what I haven't publicly acknowledged until now, is the full nature of my relationship with him." Eleanor glanced at Marcus, who stood beside her, his posture straight, his expression composed. They had spent the night preparing for this moment, discussing how much to reveal, how to frame their complicated history. "When Marcus lost his sight 10 years ago," Eleanor went on, "architecture lost one of its most innovative voices. The accident occurred shortly after a professional disagreement between us, one of many in our long-standing rivalry. A rivalry that defined both our careers," Marcus added, speaking for the first time. "We pushed each other to excel, to innovate, to refine our respective approaches." Eleanor nodded, then realized the gesture was lost on both Marcus and the jury. "After Marcus withdrew from practice, I found myself in the position of completing several projects he had initiated. In doing so, I recognized the unique value of his design philosophy, a perspective that emphasized human experience over mere visual impact, that understood how people actually inhabit spaces rather than just how those spaces appear in photographs." "What Eleanor is diplomatically avoiding saying," Marcus interjected with a small smile, "is that she discovered I had been right about several aspects of design that we had argued about for years." A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the jury, easing the tension slightly. "As I incorporated these insights into my work," Eleanor continued, "I began keeping detailed records, partly as professional acknowledgement, partly out of a sense that these innovations shouldn't be lost to the field simply because their originator could no longer practice, and partly out of guilt," Marcus added more seriously now, "which brings us to the aspect of our relationship that isn't documented in those files." Eleanor took a deep breath. This was the moment of greatest vulnerability, the revelation they had debated most intensely whether to share. "For the past 10 years, I have been anonymously paying Marcus Reed's mortgage," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. An arrangement he discovered only recently, when a bank error revealed the duplicate payments. The jury members straightened in their seats, several leaning forward with newly focused attention. The payments matched almost exactly the profits, derived from projects that incorporated elements of Marcus's design philosophy, Eleanor explained. "It was, in my mind, a form of royalty, compensation for intellectual contributions that could not be formally acknowledged while maintaining the fiction that our professional relationship had ended. A fiction that benefited Eleanor's career considerably," Marcus noted. "After all, who wants to admit that their creative evolution has been substantially influenced by a former rival?" His tone was light, but the observation cut close to the truth. Eleanor winced slightly before continuing. "When Marcus discovered the payments 2 months ago, he confronted me. That confrontation led, somewhat improbably, to the collaboration that produced the design before you today." She gestured toward the screen, where images of their proposal were displayed. "This design represents not just a fusion of our distinct approaches, but a new methodology developed through our partnership, one that engages with architecture as a multi-sensory experience that values how spaces feel as much as how they look. A methodology that neither of us could have developed alone," Marcus added, "and one that would not exist without the complicated ethically ambiguous history that brought us to this point. There was a long moment of silence as the jury processed this unprecedented revelation. Finally, James Henderson, the jury chairman, spoke. "This is extraordinary," he said, his tone measured. "I've been judging architectural competitions for 25 years, and I've never encountered anything quite like this situation." "Neither have we," Eleanor acknowledged with a small smile. "I appreciate your candor," Henderson continued, "but it raises questions about intellectual attribution that extend beyond this competition." "We understand that," Marcus said, "and we are prepared to address those questions after you've evaluated our design on its merits. Because regardless of the circumstances that led to our collaboration, the work itself deserves consideration." Henderson studied them for a long moment, then nodded. "Proceed with your presentation." For the next 30 minutes, Eleanor and Marcus presented their proposal, each contributing insights that reflected their unique perspective. Eleanor addressed the technical and structural innovations, while Marcus spoke eloquently about the experiential elements, how the spaces would feel to inhabitants, how sound would travel through different areas, how texture and temperature would guide movement. The jury's questions were pointed but fair, focused primarily on the design itself rather than the revelations that had preceded it. As the formal presentation concluded, Henderson asked the rest of the team to leave the room for the private session he had requested. Once they were alone with the jury, the questioning turned to the ethical implications of their past arrangement. "Ms. Winters," one juror asked, "did you ever consider that your actions, however well-intentioned, effectively appropriated Mr. Reed's intellectual property without his consent?" Eleanor met the woman's gaze directly. "Yes, I considered it extensively, and I justified it to myself in various ways, that I was preserving ideas that might otherwise be lost, that I was indirectly compensating him through the mortgage payments, that I was honoring his legacy in the field." "But," the juror prompted, "but I now recognize that those justifications were incomplete," Eleanor admitted, "that there were other motivations I wasn't fully acknowledging, even to myself." "Such as?" Eleanor glanced at Marcus before answering. "Such as the fact that our rivalry had always been more complex than simple competition, that his perspective had always been necessary to the full expression of my own. That in some fundamental way, I didn't know how to be an architect without Marcus Reed as a counterpoint." The honesty of her response seemed to surprise even Marcus, whose expression shifted subtly. "Mr. Reed," another juror asked, "given that you were unaware of this arrangement for a decade, do you consider yourself exploited by Ms. Winters' actions?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Initially, I felt violated, both professionally and personally. The idea that someone had been secretly paying my mortgage, especially someone I had considered a rival, was profoundly unsettling." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "But as I've come to understand the full context, my perspective has evolved. Was there an element of exploitation? Perhaps, but there was also preservation, acknowledgement, and a strange kind of respect. Eleanor kept my ideas alive when I couldn't. She maintained a connection I had severed, and she created a framework for my eventual return to the field, however unintentional that might have been." "So you've forgiven her?" the juror pressed. Marcus smiled slightly. "Forgiveness implies a simple moral calculus. Wrong done, apology offered, absolution granted. What exists between Eleanor and me is far more complex. We're still discovering all the dimensions of our connection, still navigating what it means for our future work." "And what does it mean for your future work?" Henderson asked, directing the question to both of them. "Is this collaboration a one-time arrangement or something more enduring?" Eleanor and Marcus exchanged a glance, a habit they had developed despite his blindness, a silent communication that had become meaningful even when only one of them could see the other. "That's a decision we're still in the process of making," Eleanor answered. "The collaboration has been transformative for both of us professionally, but it also raises complex questions about credit, attribution, and how we present our relationship to the wider architectural community. Not to mention the personal implications," Marcus added quietly. The jury members exchanged glances at this enigmatic addition, but no one pursued it further. "Thank you for your candor," Henderson said finally. "This has been an unusual situation, to say the least. We'll announce our decision regarding the competition tomorrow as scheduled." As they left the presentation room, Eleanor and Marcus walked, in silence, both processing the intensity of what had just transpired. The rest of the team had dispersed, giving them privacy to decompress after the grueling examination. "Do you think we still have a chance?" Eleanor asked as they stepped outside into the bright afternoon. "At winning the competition?" Marcus shrugged. "Possibly. The design is strong enough to overcome the complications, but in a way, that's not the most important question right now." "What is?" Marcus turned toward her, his expression serious. "What you said in there about not knowing how to be an architect without me as a counterpoint, was that true?" Eleanor hesitated, then answered with the same honesty she had offered the jury. "Yes, for better or worse, my creative identity has been shaped by our relationship. First as rivals, then as whatever we've been these past 10 years. And whatever we are now," Marcus added softly. "Yes." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the day's revelations settling around them. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice reflective. "We've spent so many years defining ourselves in relation to each other, first in opposition, then in this strange, secret connection. Maybe it's time we figured out who we are together, openly." "What exactly are you suggesting, Marcus?" "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that regardless of tomorrow's decision, we consider making this collaboration permanent. Not just professionally, but—" He left the sentence unfinished, the implication hanging between them, a possibility neither had been prepared to articulate until this moment of reckoning had forced their hands. Eleanor looked at the man before her, once her fiercest competitor, then her secret responsibility, now her creative partner. The complexity of their history might have been exposed sooner than they were prepared for, but perhaps that exposure had accelerated a recognition that was long overdue. "Let's not make any decisions today," she said finally. "We're both exhausted emotionally and mentally, but tomorrow after the announcement—" "Tomorrow," Marcus agreed. "When we know where we stand with the competition, we can decide where we stand with each other." As they parted ways, Eleanor to the office, Marcus to his home, both carried with them the awareness that regardless of the jury's decision, they had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning. The secrets that had bound them together for a decade had been exposed to the light, forcing them to confront not just the ethical implications of their past arrangement, but the deeper connection it had both masked and maintained. The competition results would matter, certainly. But the truly decisive moment had already occurred, in their mutual decision to face the scrutiny together, to present themselves as partners despite the complications, to acknowledge publicly the intertwining of their professional and personal lives that had persisted in one form or another for nearly 15 years. Whatever tomorrow brought, nothing would be the same again. The call came at 9:17 the following morning. Eleanor was in her office, attempting to focus on routine work while waiting for the competition results, when her phone displayed James Henderson's name. "James," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Eleanor," he replied, his tone giving nothing away. "Is Marcus with you?" "No, he's at home." "I see. I'd prefer to deliver this news to both of you simultaneously, if possible." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Of course. I can conference him in." A minute later, the three of them were connected. "Thank you both for your presentation yesterday," Henderson began formally. The jury was deeply impressed by the design itself, which demonstrated remarkable sensitivity to both historical context and contemporary needs. Eleanor closed her eyes, bracing herself for the but that would surely follow. "We were equally struck by your candor regarding the unusual circumstances of your collaboration," Henderson continued. "It raised significant ethical questions that we debated extensively." "And your conclusion?" Marcus asked, his voice calm. There was a pause before Henderson responded. "Our conclusion is that architecture at its best has always been a dialogue between past and present, between vision and execution, between different perspectives on what spaces can and should be. Your collaboration, despite its unconventional origins, embodies that dialogue in a profound way. Eleanor opened her eyes, hardly daring to hope. It is therefore my pleasure to inform you that the jury has unanimously selected your proposal for the Blackwood Warehouse District Rehabilitation. For a moment, neither Eleanor nor Marcus spoke, both absorbing the unexpected news. "Thank you, James," Eleanor finally managed. "We're surprised and honored." "There is one condition," Henderson added. "The jury requests that the implementation phase include educational components, public lectures, student workshops, documentation of your collaborative process. We believe your partnership represents a valuable model for the field, particularly in how it integrates diverse sensory approaches to architectural design." "We would be happy to accommodate that request," Marcus said. After ending the call, Eleanor sat motionless at her desk, emotions washing over her in waves. Relief, vindication, something that felt suspiciously like joy. Her phone rang again, Marcus calling back. "Did that really just happen?" he asked when she answered. Eleanor laughed, a sound of pure release after weeks of tension. "It did. We won. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it." "I need to see you," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Not to celebrate the win, though we should do that too, but to talk about what comes next." "I can come to your place," Eleanor offered. "No," Marcus countered. "Let's meet at the Thompson Center, the building you built from my design. It seems appropriate." An hour later, Eleanor found Marcus waiting in the center's soaring atrium, a space defined by light and sound, where visitors instinctively looked upward toward the intricate pattern of skylights that dappled the interior with ever-changing illumination. "It's beautiful," she said as she approached him. "Every time I come here, I'm reminded of how right you were about this space." Marcus turned toward her voice, a small smile playing at his lips. "And how wrong you were about the structural challenges." "That too," Eleanor admitted with a matching smile, "though I did solve those challenges eventually." "Yes, you did." Marcus gestured to a seating area beside a small reflecting pool. "Shall we?" As they sat, the ambient sounds of the atrium enveloped them, footsteps echoing on marble, quiet conversations, water rippling in the pool. It was a space designed to be experienced with all senses, a philosophy that had been ahead of its time when Marcus first conceived it, and that had now become central to their collaborative approach. "I've been thinking about what Henderson said," Marcus began, "about architecture being a dialogue." "So have I," Eleanor agreed. "It seems like such an obvious insight, yet one the field often forgets in its emphasis on individual genius." "We certainly forgot it during our competitive years." "We did," Eleanor acknowledged, "though perhaps we were engaging in dialogue even then, just not consciously." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I've been reflecting on since yesterday's presentation. How much of my work was shaped by anticipating your critiques, by wanting to prove my approach superior to yours, and how, after losing my sight, I lost that dialogue, at least I thought I had. While I continued it in secret," Eleanor completed his thought, "incorporating your perspective into my work without acknowledging it publicly. Until now." "Until now," she echoed. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, each processing the implications of this revelation. "I have something to confess," Marcus said finally. "Something I haven't told you about the accident." Eleanor turned toward him, suddenly alert. "What about it?" Marcus's fingers traced the edge of the bench they sat on, a nervous gesture she had come to recognize. "The night it happened, after our argument, I was distracted, upset. Not just about our professional disagreement, but about something more personal." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Marcus said carefully, "that our rivalry had become something else for me, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. The intensity of our competitions, the way we anticipated each other's approaches, it had created a connection that went beyond professional respect." Eleanor's breath caught. "Marcus, let me finish," he said gently. "That night I realized I had developed feelings for you, Complicated, conflicted feelings that made no sense given our history. And it terrified me. So I drove too fast, paid too little attention, and, well, you know the result. The revelation hung in the air between them, fundamentally altering the narrative they had both carried for a decade. "You never said anything," Eleanor whispered. "In the hospital when I tried to visit. I was ashamed," Marcus admitted, and then angry at myself, at the circumstances, at the twist of fate that had taken my sight, just as I was beginning to see something clearly for the first time. It was easier to shut you out completely than to face those complications. Eleanor was silent, processing this new information that recontextualized their entire history. "When I discovered the mortgage payments," Marcus continued, "I was initially furious. But beneath that anger was something else, the realization that you had maintained a connection even as I tried to sever it. That despite everything, we remained linked in some fundamental way. I told myself it was professional duty," Eleanor said softly, "ethical obligation. But that was never the whole truth." "What was the whole truth, Eleanor?" She took a deep breath, facing a question she had avoided for years. "The truth is that I missed you, not just your architectural voice, though that was part of it, but you, your challenges, your provocations, the way you pushed me to be better than I thought I could be." "Professional appreciation," Marcus suggested, but his tone indicated he knew there was more. "At first," Eleanor acknowledged, "but over time, as I continued integrating your approach into my work, continued making those payments, it became something else, a connection I couldn't name, but couldn't sever either." "And now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the atrium. "Can you name it now?" Eleanor looked at the man beside her, once her rival, then her secret responsibility, now her collaborator. The complexity of their history had shaped both their careers and their personal development in ways neither could have anticipated. "Now," she said softly, "I think it might be love. Not simple or straightforward, not uncomplicated by our past, but real nonetheless." Marcus was still for a long moment. Then, with the precision that characterized his movements since losing his sight, he reached for her hand, finding it unerringly. "That," he said, "is the most profound revelation of all. That after everything, the rivalry, the accident, the secret payments, the belated collaboration, we would arrive here together." "Is it too complicated?" Eleanor asked, vulnerability evident in her voice. "Our history, the power dynamics, the professional entanglements." "Undoubtedly," Marcus smiled. "But then we've never been drawn to simple solutions, have we? Our best work has always embraced complexity rather than avoiding it." He squeezed her hand gently. "The question isn't whether it's complicated. The question is whether it's worth navigating those complications. For me, the answer is yes. What about for you?" In that moment, sitting in the building that represented both their separate talents and their intertwined legacies, Eleanor felt a clarity that had eluded her for years. The mortgage payments, the secret record-keeping, the persistent influence of Marcus's design philosophy on her work, all had been expressions of a connection she hadn't been ready to name. "Yes," she said simply, "it's worth it." "Then perhaps, here's time for a new kind of partnership," Marcus suggested, "one that acknowledges all dimensions of our connection, professional and personal, past and future." "What would that look like?" Eleanor asked. "I'm not entirely sure," Marcus admitted. "We'll have to design it together, like our Blackwood proposal. But I know it would include continued collaboration at the firm, public acknowledgement of our shared design philosophy, and—" He paused, smiling slightly. "No more secret mortgage payments." Eleanor laughed, the sound echoing in the atrium. "Agreed, though I think we can afford to be more generous with attribution than we have been in the past. Both of us." "Both of us," Marcus echoed. "That's the key, isn't it? Not you supporting me in secret, not me contributing from the shadows, but both of us openly together." As they sat in the building that bore witness to their complicated history, Eleanor felt the weight of the past decade transforming, not disappearing, but reshaping itself into something new. The secret that had been exposed against their will had forced a reckoning, but that reckoning had led to an understanding neither might have reached otherwise. "There will be challenges," she cautioned. "Professional, practical, personal." "Without doubt," Marcus agreed. "But I've learned something important in the past 10 years, Eleanor. Challenges look different depending on your perspective. What seems insurmountable from one angle might be navigable from another." "Is that your way of saying blindness has given you insight?" Eleanor asked, a smile in her voice. "It's my way of saying that losing one kind of vision helped me develop another," Marcus replied, "and that vision includes you. Has always included you, even when I couldn't see it clearly." The profound revelation that had been building between them throughout their collaboration crystallized in that moment. That their lives had never truly separated, that the connection they now acknowledged openly had persisted through rivalry, absence, and secret support. That what they had interpreted as competition had always contained elements of complementarity, and that perhaps the most innovative design they would ever create would be the relationship that emerged from this complex, ethically ambiguous, emotionally honest foundation. As light shifted through the skylights above, casting new patterns across the atrium, Eleanor and Marcus began the conversation that would shape this new architecture, a structure built not of concrete and glass, but of shared vision, mutual respect, and the love that had hidden beneath the surface of their connection all along. 6 months after winning the Blackwood Warehouse District competition, Eleanor and Marcus stood together on the construction site, observing the early stages of implementation. Their design was coming to life around them, historical brick facades being carefully restored, while modern interventions began to take shape within the old industrial structures. Their professional collaboration had evolved into a smooth, efficient partnership. Marcus had officially joined Winters Design Associates as creative design partner, a position created specifically to leverage his unique perspective on spatial experience. The firm had invested in advanced technologies that enabled him to fully participate in the design process: tactile modeling systems, acoustic simulators, and the sonic sight device that had proven so valuable in their early work. Together, their personal relationship had developed more cautiously, both aware of the complexities inherent in their history. They had agreed to proceed deliberately, building a foundation of transparency and mutual respect that stood in stark contrast to the secrecy that had defined their connection for so long. "The masons are doing beautiful work on the east facade," Eleanor remarked as they walked the perimeter of the site. "The restored brickwork looks almost exactly as it did in the historical photographs." "How does it feel?" Marcus asked, running his hand along the wall beside them. "Texture is as important as appearance for these historical elements." Eleanor guided his hand to a different section. "Feel the difference between the original bricks and the replacements." Marcus's fingers moved carefully across the surface, a slight frown forming. "The replacement bricks are too uniform. They lack the subtle irregularities that give the original masonry its character." "I'll speak to the contractors about it," Eleanor agreed. "You're right. The tactile experience should match the visual authenticity." This kind of exchange had become common between them, Eleanor providing visual information, Marcus contributing insights about non-visual aspects that might otherwise be overlooked. Their complementary perspectives had resulted in a design approach that was gaining recognition throughout the industry as uniquely comprehensive in its consideration of how people experienced built environments. As they continued their inspection, Eleanor's phone rang. She checked the screen, then answered. "Richard," she greeted her COO, "we're just finishing at the Blackwood site. How did the client meeting go?" As she listened to Richard's report, her expression shifted from professional interest to concern. "I see. Yes, we'll head back to the office now. Have everyone gather in the main conference room." Ending the call, she turned to Marcus. "We have a situation." "What kind of situation?" he asked, immediately alert to the tension in her voice. "Paul has resigned," Eleanor said, naming her cousin and the firm's financial director. "And he's taking clients with him, specifically the Westridge Foundation and Meridian Developments." Marcus stilled. "Those are two of your largest clients." "Yes, and apparently Paul has been planning this move for some time. Richard says he's established his own firm, Reed Winters Designs." "Reed Winters?" Marcus repeated. disbelief evident in his tone. "He's using my name." "It seems so," Eleanor confirmed grimly, "and he's telling clients that he's the one who preserved your design philosophy all these years, that I merely executed while he maintained the true vision. That's absurd. Paul barely knew me before the accident, and he certainly hasn't been involved in our current collaboration." "No, but he had access to all those records I kept, the side-by-side comparisons, the documentation of your influence, and as financial director, he knew about the mortgage payments." Marcus absorbed this information, his expression hardening. "He's the one who leaked the files to the competition jury." "Almost. Certainly," Eleanor agreed, "though we can't prove it. And now he's positioning himself as the true inheritor of our combined legacy, while simultaneously undermining the firm financially by poaching our major clients," Eleanor added. "It's a calculated attack." They returned to the office to find the senior team assembled, faces tense with concern. Richard had already briefed them on Paul's departure and the client defections. "What we don't yet know," Richard explained as Eleanor and Marcus joined the meeting, "is how many other clients Paul has approached. Westridge and Meridian are confirmed losses, but there could be others considering a switch. We need to contact everyone immediately," Eleanor decided. "Personally, not through representatives. I'll take our East Coast clients, Richard can handle West Coast, and Sophia can manage international." The team nodded, already mobilizing to contain the damage. "What about Reed Winter's Designs?" asked Sophia. "The name itself implies a connection that doesn't exist. Can we challenge that legally?" Eleanor looked to Marcus, deferring to him on the use of his name. "It's deliberately misleading," Marcus agreed, "but legal action would be public, messy, and time-consuming, exactly the kind of distraction Paul wants us to engage in while he solidifies his position with our clients." "So we just let him get away with it?" Sophia pressed, clearly frustrated. "No," Marcus said firmly. "We respond not by attacking him directly, but by demonstrating the authenticity of our partnership in ways he can't match. The Blackwood project provides the perfect platform. It's high-profile, it's innovative, and it represents our genuine collaboration." "Marcus is right," Eleanor added. "Paul can claim to represent our combined legacy, but he can't replicate our actual working relationship or the design approach it generates." The discussion continued, strategies forming for client retention, public messaging, and legal protections. Throughout, Eleanor observed how naturally Marcus had integrated into the firm's leadership, how readily the team now looked to him for guidance on certain issues. It was late evening by the time the crisis management plan was fully established. Most of the team had departed, leaving Eleanor and Marcus alone in her office. "Paul's timing is strategic," Marcus observed, fatigue evident in his voice. "With the Blackwood project underway and several other major commissions in development, we're at a vulnerable point. Losing key clients now could create cash flow problems that would force us to scale back our ambitions. Or compromise on quality to reduce costs," Eleanor agreed. "Neither is acceptable." They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the magnitude of the threat they faced. "I should have seen this coming," Eleanor said finally. "Paul never fully supported our collaboration. He was the most skeptical during that initial team meeting, remember? The one where he questioned your participation in the competition presentation. You couldn't have anticipated this level of betrayal," Marcus countered. "He's family, after all," which gave him access and trust he wouldn't otherwise have had. Eleanor's voice held a bitter edge. "He used my own records against me once before with the competition jury. I should have been more cautious afterward." "We both underestimated him," Marcus acknowledged, "but dwelling on that won't help us now. We need to focus on the response." Eleanor nodded, pulling herself back to the present challenge. "You're right, and your approach makes sense. Demonstrate rather than declare the value of our partnership." "It's not just strategy," Marcus said. "It's truth. What we've built together these past months is real, professionally and personally. Paul can appropriate the names, he can memorize the design principles, but he can't replicate the actual dialogue between us, the genuine integration of our perspectives." Eleanor looked at him, struck by the certainty in his voice despite the crisis they faced. "When did you become the optimist in this relationship?" she asked, a small smile breaking through her concern. Probably around the time you became my eyes and I became your conscience, Marcus replied with matching humor. We've been trading roles for years, it seems. The moment of lightness faded as they returned to the practical matters at hand. We should consider the financial implications, Eleanor said. Even with aggressive client retention efforts, we're likely looking at a significant revenue reduction in the short term. Which means budget adjustments, Marcus agreed. But not at the expense of the accessibility technologies we've implemented or the educational initiatives we promised the Blackwood jury. Those are non-negotiable, Eleanor confirmed. They represent the core of our shared vision. We'll find savings elsewhere. As they discussed potential adjustments, the depth of their commitment to their shared principles became increasingly evident. Despite the maximum conflict they now faced, a deliberate attack on both their professional reputation and financial stability, neither suggested compromising the values that had defined their collaboration. There's something else we should consider, Marcus said as their planning session wound down, a more personal implication of Paul's actions. What's that? He's forcing a public reckoning with our history sooner than we might have chosen, Marcus explained. The story he's telling about preserving my legacy, about the true nature of our relationship, it's a distortion, but it will require us to counter with our own narrative. Our own truth, Eleanor corrected softly. Yes, are we ready for that? For the full complexity of our history to become public knowledge, not just within the industry, but potentially more broadly. It was a profound question, one that went beyond professional considerations to the heart of their evolving personal relationship. The narrative Paul was constructing threatened not just their business, but the careful, deliberate progression of their connection, forcing them to define publicly what they were still exploring privately. I don't know if we're ready, Eleanor admitted, but I know we don't have the luxury of waiting until we are. Paul has ensured that. Then perhaps, Marcus suggested, we should view this not just as a crisis to manage, but as a catalyst, an opportunity to fully integrate the personal and professional aspects of our relationship rather than keeping them carefully separated. Eleanor considered this perspective. They had been cautious in how they presented their partnership to the world, emphasizing its professional dimensions while keeping the more personal aspects private. Paul's actions were stripping away that option, compelling them to engage with the full truth of their connection. Integration rather than separation, she repeated thoughtfully. That does align with our design philosophy, doesn't it? The idea that experiences shouldn't be artificially compartmentalized. Exactly, Marcus agreed. We've been advocating for holistic approaches to spatial design while maintaining somewhat artificial distinctions in our own relationship. Because it's complicated, Eleanor reminded him. The history, the power dynamics. Life is complicated, Marcus interrupted gently. Architecture is complicated. We embrace that complexity in our work. Perhaps it's time we embraced it more fully in how we present ourselves to the world. As they sat together in the quiet office, the magnitude of the conflict they faced became increasingly clear. Paul's betrayal had created a maximum threat to their business, to their reputation, to the narrative of their relationship. But it had also created an opportunity for maximum commitment to the vision they shared and the connection they had built. So we move forward, Eleanor said finally, not just professionally, but personally, not hiding any aspect of our history or our present. We move forward, Marcus agreed, reaching for her hand across the desk. Together, openly, completely. The decision marked a turning point, a response to maximum conflict that didn't retreat into defensiveness or compromise, but instead advanced into greater authenticity and deeper commitment. In challenging their partnership at its foundation, Paul had inadvertently strengthened it, forcing a level of integration they might otherwise have approached more gradually. As they left the office that night, walking together through the quiet streets, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of apprehension and certainty. The conflict they faced was substantial, the challenges real, but the foundation they had built, through rivalry, through secret connection, through deliberate collaboration, and now through open commitment, was stronger than any attack Paul could mount. What he had intended as a devastating blow had instead become the catalyst for the final integration of their personal and professional lives, a fusion of perspectives, principles, and purposes that would define not just their architectural practice, but their shared future. 1 year after Paul's departure and the establishment of Reed Winter's designs, Eleanor stood at the window of her office, watching as evening shadows lengthened across the city. Behind her, the wall that had once displayed her personal achievements now featured a carefully curated exhibition of their collaborative work. Photographs of completed projects, models of designs in progress, and at the center, a tactile representation of the Blackwood Warehouse District, now 8 months into construction and already transforming the urban landscape. The past year had been one of profound challenges and equally profound growth. Paul's betrayal, intended to destabilize their partnership, had instead catalyzed its evolution in unexpected ways. The initial months had been difficult, certainly. Several medium-sized clients had followed Westridge and Meridian to Paul's new firm, creating financial pressures that required careful management. The team had worked relentlessly to retain existing clients and secure new commissions, often putting in long hours and accepting projects they might previously have declined. Yet amid these challenges, something remarkable had emerged. The firm had been forced to articulate more clearly what made their approach distinctive: the integration of visual and non-visual experience, the emphasis on architecture as a multi-sensory engagement, the genuine collaboration between complementary perspectives. This clarification of purpose had not only helped retain loyal clients, but had attracted new ones specifically interested in their innovative methodology. The door opened, and Marcus entered, his movements through the office now confident and familiar after a year of daily presence. "The Harrington Center models have arrived," he announced. "The fabrication team says they're ready for your review." "Already?" Eleanor turned from the window. "They weren't due until next week." "Apparently your gentle encouragement at the last meeting was particularly motivating," Marcus replied with a smile. Eleanor laughed. "You mean my not-so-subtle reminder that their deadline had already been extended twice?" "That would be the one." They moved together to the large workspace adjoining Eleanor's office, where a series of detailed tactile models had been arranged on the central table. These were no ordinary architectural models. They had been specially designed to communicate different sensory aspects of the proposed cultural center, from acoustic properties to thermal variations to movement flows. Marcus ran his hands over the first model, his fingers reading the space as fluently as sighted architects read drawings. "The main hall feels right," he observed. "The proportions create the sense of elevation we wanted, without losing human scale." Eleanor studied the same model visually, noting how light would interact with the designed surfaces. "The ceiling configuration works better than I expected. The reflected illumination will be subtle but effective." This dual analysis had become their standard practice, each contributing insights from their primary mode of perception, creating a more comprehensive understanding than either could achieve alone. What had initially been an accommodation for Marcus's blindness had transformed into a methodology that enhanced their work regardless of ability or limitation. "Have you seen the revised prospectus?" Marcus asked as they continued examining the models. "Not yet," Eleanor replied. "Richard mentioned it was nearly complete. It arrived this morning. The repositioning is significant." Eleanor glanced at him, noting the careful neutrality in his tone. Significant good or significant concerning? Neither necessarily, just different from where we were a year ago. More explicitly focused on sensory integration as our core philosophy. Less emphasis on the firm's historical achievements. "Less emphasis on my historical achievements, you mean?" Eleanor clarified, no defensiveness in her voice. "Yes," Marcus acknowledged. "Though your previous work is still prominently featured, it's presented as part of an evolutionary process, leading to our current approach rather than as the foundation of the firm's identity." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "That seems appropriate, doesn't it? An accurate reflection of where we are now rather than where we started. You're not concerned about the diminished focus on your individual legacy?" The question was gentle but probing, touching on a transformation that had occurred gradually throughout the year. Eleanor's shift from a primarily individual professional identity to one defined increasingly by their partnership. "A year ago, I might have been," she admitted, "but now the work we're doing together feels more significant than anything I achieved alone. More complete, somehow." Marcus was quiet for a moment, his hands still on the model before him. "That's a substantial shift in perspective for someone who spent decades building a reputation as a singular visionary." "Is it really so surprising?" Eleanor asked. "You experienced the same transformation just earlier and under more difficult circumstances." "I didn't have much choice," Marcus pointed out. "Blindness forced me to reconsider everything about my practice, my identity, my place in the field. You've chosen this evolution voluntarily." Eleanor considered this distinction. "Perhaps, though Paul's actions didn't leave us many alternatives." "They limited our options," Marcus agreed, "but they didn't dictate our response. You could have fought harder to preserve your individual prominence, positioned our collaboration as a temporary arrangement rather than a fundamental reorientation. Is that what you expected me to do?" "Honestly, yes, at first. The Eleanor Winters I competed against for all those years was fiercely protective of her professional identity. She didn't share credit easily." Eleanor smiled slightly at his characterization. "That Eleanor Winters existed in opposition to Marcus Reed. This one exists in partnership with him. Different relationships, different priorities." The simple statement encapsulated the profound transformation of the past year, not just in their professional arrangements, but in Eleanor's fundamental understanding of success and fulfillment. What had once been measured in individual accolades and personal recognition was now assessed through the quality and impact of their shared vision. "Speaking of partnerships," Marcus said, changing the subject, "have you seen the latest from Reed Winters Designs?" Eleanor sighed. "The Westmark Hotel?" "Yes," Richard forwarded the press release. "Thoughts?" "Technically proficient," Eleanor acknowledged. "Aesthetically coherent, but lacking the depth we would have brought to it. The design prioritizes visual impact over integrated experience, exactly the limitation we've moved beyond together. Yet it bears both our names," Marcus observed, a hint of lingering frustration in his voice. "In name only," Eleanor countered. "Anyone who understands architecture can see the difference between appropriation and authentic collaboration." The existence of Reed Winters Designs remained a persistent irritation, but its impact had diminished over time. Paul had achieved some success by trading on the combined reputation of their names, but without the substance of their actual partnership, his work lacked the distinctive quality that was increasingly defining their genuine collaboration. As they completed their review of the Harrington models, Marcus's phone chimed with a reminder. "The students will be arriving in 30 minutes, he noted. "Should we move to the education space?" The education space was a recent addition to the office, a dedicated area designed for the workshops and lectures they had promised as part of the Blackwood competition. What had begun as an obligation had evolved into a central aspect of their practice, with regular programs for architecture students, practicing professionals, and community members interested in how built environments shaped experience. "Let's finish here first," Eleanor suggested. "I want to make notes on the acoustic mapping before we're interrupted." They worked together efficiently, Eleanor documenting visual observations while Marcus dictated his tactile analysis. Their process had become so seamless that it was sometimes difficult to recall how awkward their early collaborations had been. The tentative trust, the careful navigation around historical tensions, the uncertainty about how to integrate their different perceptual approaches. Now, a year into their partnership, those initial adjustments had given way to a fluidity that enhanced rather than constrained their work. What had begun as accommodation had transformed into innovation, a methodology that was increasingly being recognized throughout the industry as pioneering. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," Eleanor remarked as they wrapped up their notes, "about the limitation of always starting with visual concepts and then adapting them for non-visual experience." "And," Marcus prompted, "and I think you're right. We should experiment with reversing the process, beginning with acoustic or tactile, concepts and developing the visual elements in response to those. That would be a significant departure from traditional practice, Marcus observed. So is most of what we do, Eleanor countered with a smile. Why stop innovating now? As they moved to the education space to prepare for the arriving students, Eleanor reflected on how naturally they had fallen into the rhythm of mutual challenge and support, each continuously pushing the other toward new possibilities while providing the foundation that made innovation feasible. It was so different from their old rivalry, which had been characterized by competition rather than collaboration, by the desire to prove superiority rather than achieve complementarity. Yet, in another sense, it was an evolution rather than a reversal of that dynamic, the same intensity and mutual influence, but channeled toward shared rather than opposing goals. The transformation had not been simple or straightforward. There had been difficult moments throughout the year, disagreements about design, approaches, tensions regarding the division of responsibilities, occasional resurfaces of old competitive instincts. The legacy of their complicated history could not be erased overnight, nor could the habits of independence that both had developed over decades of practice. But with each challenge, each negotiation, each mutual adjustment, the partnership had strengthened, not despite the difficulties, but because of the ways they navigated them together. The transformation hadn't been about eliminating their differences, but about integrating them into a more comprehensive whole. As the first students began to arrive, young architects eager to learn about the innovative approach that was generating such interest throughout the industry, Eleanor watched Marcus prepare his materials, his confidence in this teaching role, having grown substantially over the past year. "Ready?" she asked as the room filled with voices and movement. Marcus turned toward her, a smile lighting his face. "Ready," he confirmed. "Let's show them what architecture can be when it engages all the senses." And in that moment, Eleanor understood with perfect clarity how complete the transformation had been. From rivals to secret benefactor and unwitting recipient, from cautious collaborators to true partners, what had begun as a crisis of revelation had become the foundation for the most fulfilling phase of both their careers, a collaboration that had not diminished either of their voices, but had instead created a dialogue far richer than any monologue could have been. The journey had been long and often difficult, with moments of profound conflict and equally profound connection. But standing now at the threshold of this next engagement, sharing their vision with the coming generation of architects, Eleanor felt not regret for what had been lost, but gratitude for what had been gained. A partnership that honored both, their distinct perspectives and their shared purpose, that acknowledged their complex history while continuously creating their future. It was, in every sense, a transformation worth reflecting upon. The Blackwood Warehouse district stood transformed, historical industrial structures now seamlessly integrated with contemporary interventions. Where once there had been abandoned buildings and empty lots, now there was vibrant public space. The rehabilitation project that had begun as a competition entry had become a celebrated urban renewal success. On the evening of the official opening, Eleanor and Marcus stood together at the edge of the central plaza, listening to the sounds of celebration echoing through the space they had envisioned and brought to life. Local officials gave speeches, musicians performed on the amphitheater stage, and hundreds of community members explored the new district, experiencing firsthand the careful balance between preservation and innovation that characterized the design. "Describe it to me," Marcus requested quietly, his hand resting lightly on Eleanor's arm. Though he had explored the construction site regularly throughout the development process, experiencing the space tactilely and acoustically, he wanted to understand how it appeared now, completed and filled with people. Eleanor took a moment to observe, translating visual information into words that would create meaning for him. "The evening light is catching the copper elements we installed in the eastern facade, making them glow almost like they're illuminated from within. People are gathering around the fountain. Children are running through the water jets despite the cool evening. The projections on the North Warehouse wall are starting, images from the district's industrial history transitioning into contemporary art." "And the sound?" Marcus prompted. Eleanor smiled, recognizing his gentle reminder that her descriptions still tended to prioritize visual elements. The acoustics are working exactly as you predicted. You can hear distinct conversations from the cafe terraces, but they blend into a pleasant background murmur rather than chaotic noise. The music from the amphitheater is contained within that space, present but not overwhelming. And there's this wonderful resonance in the covered walkway between the main warehouses. People are discovering it, stopping to listen to how their voices change within that space. Marcus nodded, satisfied with this more comprehensive description. "It feels right," he said simply. "The way people are moving through the space, discovering its different qualities, engaging with it actively, rather than just passing through." "That was always the goal," Eleanor agreed. "Not just rehabilitation, but revitalization, creating a place that invites interaction." They continued their circuit of the district, occasionally stopped by attendees offering congratulations or asking questions about specific design elements, though they had anticipated interest in their work. The emotional impact of seeing people actively engaging with the environment they had created was profound for both of them. "Ms. Winters, Mr. Reed." They turned toward the voice, finding James Henderson approaching, the jury chairman from the competition that had launched this project and exposed their complicated history to public scrutiny. "James," Eleanor greeted him warmly, "I'm glad you could make it to the opening." "I wouldn't have missed it," Henderson replied, "especially after following the development so closely these past 18 months. The result is even more impressive than your competition proposal suggested it would be." "Collaborative projects often evolve beyond their initial conception," Marcus observed. "Each contributor brings perspectives that enhance the whole." Henderson nodded. "That's precisely what I wanted to discuss with you. The educational component of this project, the workshops, the public lectures, the documentation of your design process, has generated significant interest within the field. The American Institute of Architects is considering establishing a program specifically focused on multi-sensory design approaches, and they're interested in having you both involved as founding advisors." Eleanor and Marcus exchanged a glance, a habit they maintained despite his blindness, a form of silent communication that had developed between them. "We'd be interested in hearing more," Eleanor responded. "Excellent. I'll arrange a meeting." "Next month." Henderson paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I have to admit, when I first learned about your unusual history, I had reservations about whether the partnership could succeed long-term. The ethical complications, the personal entanglements, it seemed potentially unsustainable." "Your concerns weren't unreasonable," Marcus acknowledged. "We had them ourselves. Yet here you are." Henderson gestured to the vibrant space around them, having created not just this remarkable project, but a wholly new approach to architectural practice. "It's quite remarkable." After Henderson departed, they continued their walk through the district, both reflecting on his observations about their journey. The past 18 months had indeed transformed not just the Blackwood Warehouse district, but their own relationship and professional identities. "He's right, you know," Eleanor said as they paused beside the reflecting pool at the district's center. "What we've created here goes beyond the physical structures." "You mean our design approach?" "That, yes. But also the narrative we've established about collaboration, about integrating different perspectives, about architecture as more than visual impact." Marcus was quiet for a moment, listening to the sounds of celebration around them. "A narrative built on a rather unorthodox foundation," he finally observed. "Secret mortgage payments and unattributed borrowing aren't typically included in success stories." "No," Eleanor agreed with a small smile, "but perhaps that's what makes ours authentic. We didn't hide the complications or pretend the path was straightforward. We acknowledged the ethical ambiguities, the mistakes, the missed opportunities, and in doing so, created something neither of us could have achieved alone or through conventional means." Marcus completed her thought. "Though I suspect architectural ethics classes will be debating our case for years to come." "Let them," Eleanor said, a new confidence in her voice. "The results speak for themselves." As evening deepened into night, the celebration continued around them. From across the plaza, Eleanor noticed a familiar figure approaching. Paul, her cousin and former financial director, now head of Reed Winters Designs. "Paul is here," she murmured to Marcus, tension entering her voice despite her efforts to remain composed. "Unexpected but not surprising," Marcus replied calmly. "A project of this profile would naturally attract industry attention, regardless of personal history." Paul reached them, his expression carefully neutral. "Eleanor, Marcus, congratulations on the opening. The project is impressive." "Thank you, Paul," Eleanor responded with equal formality. "I'm surprised to see you here." "Professional interest," he explained with a slight shrug, "and perhaps a certain personal curiosity as well." "About?" Marcus prompted. Paul gestured to the space around them. "About whether the reality would match the ambitious vision, whether the collaboration that began so unconventionally would produce results that justified the means." The comment was pointed, clearly referencing the ethical questions surrounding their history. 18 months earlier, such an implication might have provoked defensiveness or anger from Eleanor. Now, she merely studied her cousin with calm assessment. "The ethics of our past actions remain complex," she acknowledged, "but I believe the work we've created together has value that transcends those complications. And that justifies everything," Paul challenged, though his tone remained conversational rather than confrontational. "Not justifies," Marcus corrected, "contextualizes, places within a longer narrative of growth and transformation. The actions themselves remain what they were, ethically ambiguous, emotionally complicated." Paul seemed surprised by this candid response. "That's more nuanced than I expected." "Did you anticipate defensiveness?" Eleanor asked. "A rejection of responsibility?" "Something like that," Paul admitted, "given how things ended between us." Eleanor studied her cousin, seeing him now not as a betrayer but as someone who had made choices based on his own understanding of the situation. "Your departure was painful," she acknowledged, "but it also accelerated our evolution as partners. In a strange way, we might owe you gratitude for that catalyst." Paul laughed shortly, clearly taken aback by this perspective. "That's certainly a generous interpretation." "Not generous," Marcus corrected, "just honest. Actions often have consequences beyond their intent, positive and negative, anticipated and surprising." A brief silence fell between them, filled with the ambient sounds of the celebration continuing around them. Finally, Paul spoke again, his tone more genuine than before. "For what it's worth, what you've created here is remarkable. Not just the physical space, but the approach it represents. It's changing how people think about architectural experience." "Thank you," Eleanor said simply. "And Reed Winters Designs?" Marcus inquired, a hint of challenge in his question. Paul had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "The name was opportunistic," he acknowledged, "a decision made in the heat of departure. I've been considering a rebranding." "I think that would be appropriate," Eleanor observed, no anger in her voice despite the history between them. As Paul moved away to continue exploring the district, Eleanor and Marcus remained by the reflecting pool, the water mirroring the carefully designed lighting that illuminated the historical structures around them. "That was unexpected," Marcus commented. "The visit or my response to it?" Eleanor asked. "Both, perhaps, though your equanimity was particularly striking. A year ago, I suspect that encounter would have unfolded very differently." Eleanor considered this observation. "A year ago, I was still defining myself primarily in opposition to perceived threats, competitors, critics, betrayers. Now," she paused, searching for the right words, "now I find myself more focused on what we're creating than on who might challenge it." "A significant shift," Marcus noted. "One of many," Eleanor agreed, "though perhaps the most fundamental has been moving from seeing relationships as zero-sum competitions to understanding them as potential collaborations, even or perhaps especially when they involve different perspectives." The insight seemed to capture something essential about their journey together, from rivals to reluctant partners to genuine collaborators. The transformation hadn't erased their differences or simplified their complicated history. Rather, It had integrated those elements into a more complete understanding of what their connection could be. As they continued their circuit of the celebration, greeting community members, fellow architects, and city officials, Eleanor was struck by how natural their partnership now felt, how easily they complemented each other's strengths, compensated for each other's limitations, and enhanced each other's perspectives. The emotional resolution they had achieved hadn't come through forgetting the past or simplifying its complexities. It had emerged through fully engaging with that history, acknowledging its ethical ambiguities, and choosing to build something meaningful despite, or perhaps because of, the complicated foundation. Later that night, as they stood together on the rooftop terrace that crowned the central warehouse building, the sounds of the celebration gradually fading as the evening drew to a close, Marcus turned to Eleanor. 10 years, he said softly. What about them? She asked, though she understood the reference. 10 years you paid my mortgage without my knowledge. 10 years you incorporated my design elements into your work, while maintaining detailed records no one else would see. 10 years we remained connected, despite my efforts to sever all ties. Eleanor was quiet, allowing him to continue. And now, after everything, the revelation, the collaboration, the transformation, I find myself wondering what would have happened if you had simply approached me directly after the accident. If instead of secret payments and hidden influence, we had faced the possibilities together from the beginning. It was a question Eleanor had asked herself many times over the past 18 months. I don't know, she admitted. Perhaps nothing. You were in a dark place then, unreceptive to connection, especially from me. Perhaps, Marcus acknowledged, or perhaps we would have found our way to this partnership sooner, without the complications that still occasionally shadow it. Does it matter? Eleanor asked. The path we didn't take? Marcus considered this, his expression thoughtful in the soft lighting of the terrace. No, he finally said. What matters is that we arrived here eventually, that despite the unorthodox route, the ethical ambiguities, the missed opportunities, we found our way to this moment. He reached for her hand, finding it unerringly in the space between them. What matters is that when the secret was finally revealed, when you could have retreated into defensiveness or I into righteous anger, we both chose a different response. We chose to see the possibility rather than the problem. Eleanor squeezed his hand gently, the gesture conveying what words might have made too explicit. We chose to build rather than destroy, she agreed, to create rather than condemn. Around them, the Blackwood Warehouse District stood as physical testimony to that choice, historical structures preserved rather than demolished, contemporary. Elements integrated rather than imposed, different eras and approaches harmonized rather than placed in opposition. It was, Eleanor realized, the perfect metaphor for their own journey, a rehabilitation that honored the past while creating something new, that preserved what was valuable while transforming what needed to change. The emotional resolution they had achieved wasn't an ending, but a beginning, a foundation upon which they could continue building, both professionally and personally. The complications remained, the history couldn't be erased, but they had found a way to incorporate those elements into something stronger and more meaningful than either could have created alone. As they stood together on the rooftop, the district they had designed spread out below them, like a physical manifestation of their partnership. Eleanor felt a sense of completion that transcended professional satisfaction. What had begun as secret, obligation had transformed through crisis and collaboration into genuine connection. A resolution not through forgetting the past, but through integrating it into a more complex and truthful present. 5 years after the opening of the Blackwood Warehouse District, Eleanor and Marcus stood together in a very different space, the sleek, modernist foyer of the Reed Winters Center for Inclusive Design. The building, recently completed on the campus of MIT, represented the culmination of their evolving partnership, a permanent home for the educational initiatives that had grown from their collaboration. The students are beginning to arrive, Eleanor observed, watching as young architects and designers entered the building, their expressions reflecting the excitement of being among the first to utilize this innovative space. I can hear them, Marcus nodded, his heightened sensitivity to sound allowing him to track the increasing activity throughout the foyer. The acoustics are working exactly as we intended, distinct enough to provide orientation, but not so separated that interactions are inhibited. The center represented their most ambitious project to date, not just an architectural achievement, but an institutional one. Funded through a combination of university support, industry partnerships, and their own substantial contribution, it was dedicated to advancing multi-sensory approaches to design across disciplines. Professor Gardner is approaching, Marcus noted, recognizing the distinctive rhythm of the university liaison's footsteps. Eleanor, Marcus, Gardner greeted them warmly. Everything is prepared for the inaugural symposium. The registration count has exceeded our most optimistic projections. We've had to arrange additional seating in all the workshop spaces. That's wonderful news, Eleanor replied, though perhaps not surprising given the response to the preview publications. The preview publications were a series of articles, case studies, and design guidelines they had released over the past year, documenting the methodology they had developed through their partnership. What had begun as a distinctive approach to specific projects had evolved into a comprehensive design philosophy applicable across contexts. Several industry partners have expressed interest in expanding their involvement beyond the initial commitment, Gardner continued, particularly after touring the demonstration spaces yesterday. Which aspects resonated most strongly? Marcus inquired. The adaptive technologies certainly, but more fundamentally, the integration of different perceptual approaches into the design process itself. The idea that architecture can begin from non-visual concepts rather than always privileging sight as the primary sense. Marcus nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. This principle, that design could and should originate from multiple sensory perspectives, had become central to their work together, challenging long-standing assumptions within the field. As Gardner moved away to greet other arriving participants, Eleanor and Marcus continued their circuit of the foyer, occasionally stopping to speak with students or colleagues. Though the center bore their names, a deliberate reclamation of the Reed Winters designation that Paul had appropriated years earlier, their approach to leadership was collaborative rather than hierarchical, focused on facilitating connections across disciplines and perspectives. We should check the exhibition space before the opening session, Eleanor suggested. The installation team was still making adjustments last night. The exhibition in question occupied a large gallery adjacent to the main auditorium, a retrospective of their partnership's evolution, from the Blackwood Warehouse district through subsequent projects to the center itself. More than merely displaying their work, the exhibition was designed to communicate their process, illustrating how different sensory approaches informed each stage of development. As they entered the gallery, Eleanor was immediately struck by how effectively the installation captured their journey. The earliest projects reflected the initial adjustments of their collaboration, the somewhat awkward integration of visual and non-visual elements, the careful negotiation of their distinct perspectives. Later works demonstrated increasing fluidity and innovation as what had begun as accommodation evolved into methodology. They've incorporated the audio elements, Marcus observed, hearing the subtle soundscape that accompanied each displayed project. The acoustic signatures we developed for the Houston Performing Arts Center are particularly well represented. Eleanor guided him toward a central installation, a tactile model of the center itself, designed to be explored through touch rather than sight. As Marcus's fingers moved across the surface, reading the building's form with practiced precision, Eleanor watched his expression shift with recognition and appreciation. They've captured the progression perfectly, he commented, the way the spaces flow into one another, the transitions between different experiential zones, the integration of technological and architectural elements. It's strange, isn't it? Eleanor mused, seeing our evolving partnership represented this way, as a coherent journey rather than the complicated, often difficult process it actually was. Marcus smiled slightly. Historical narratives always simplify, emphasizing continuity over disruption, though I suspect our personal archives tell a more complex story. The personal archives he referenced included not just professional documentation, but the private records of their relationship's development. From Eleanor's secret mortgage payments through the crisis of revelation to their gradually deepening connection. These materials remained private, though elements had been shared through the educational programs they had developed. Speaking of complicated narratives, Eleanor said, her tone shifting slightly, Paul is registered for the symposium. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Interesting choice given our history. In the years since their confrontation at the Blackwood opening, relations with Paul had evolved from tense avoidance to cautious professional courtesy. He had indeed rebranded his firm, abandoning the appropriated Reed Winters designation, and had established a respectable if not groundbreaking practice, focused primarily on commercial development. He requested a private meeting before the opening session, Eleanor added. I scheduled it for noon in the East Conference Room. Do you want me there? Marcus asked. The question reflected the balance they had developed, supporting one another, while respecting each other's autonomy, particularly in situations with personal history. Though their partnership now encompassed both professional and personal dimensions, they maintained clear boundaries around individual agency. I think it would be appropriate, Eleanor replied. Whatever he wants to discuss likely concerns both of us. As they completed their review of the exhibition space, staff members began preparing for the influx of symposium participants. The center would soon be filled with hundreds of designers, architects, technologists, and students, all drawn by the innovative approach Eleanor and Marcus had pioneered together. At noon, they met Paul in the designated conference room. Though they had occasionally encountered one another at industry events over the years, this was their first private meeting since his departure from the firm process. Architecture has traditionally privileged sight above all other senses, he observed. Visual impact has been the primary metric of success, with other sensory experiences considered secondary at best. Our collaboration began by necessity, as an attempt to integrate a non-visual perspective, but it evolved into something more fundamental, a recognition that all design should engage multiple senses, that spaces should be experienced comprehensively rather than primarily visually. Eleanor continued the thought seamlessly. This approach isn't just about accessibility, though that's certainly a component. It's about enriching architectural experience for everyone, creating environments that engage more fully with human perception in all its diversity. As they presented together, their voices alternating and occasionally overlapping in practiced harmony, Eleanor was struck by how natural their partnership now felt, how completely their distinct perspectives had integrated into a shared vision, while maintaining their individual strengths. Following the formal presentation, they opened the floor for questions. A young architect in the front row raised her hand. Your partnership has become a model for collaborative practice, she began. But it emerged from a rather unconventional history: secret support, ethical complications, professional competition. How do you reconcile that complex beginning with the methodology you now advocate? The question addressed directly what had been implicit throughout their presentation: the unusual evolution from rivalry to partnership, from secrecy to transparency, from individual achievement to shared vision. Marcus smiled slightly. We don't reconcile it so much as incorporate it, he replied. The methodology we've developed doesn't pretend to have emerged fully formed or without contradiction. It's the product of our specific history, complicated, ethically ambiguous, occasionally difficult, but also genuine, Eleanor added. The value of our approach comes precisely from having navigated those complications rather than avoiding them, from recognizing that different perspectives, whether sensory, professional, or personal, don't need to be in opposition to be distinct. In architecture, as in relationships, Marcus continued, the most interesting spaces often exist at the intersection of seeming contradictions: historical and contemporary, visual and tactile, preservation and innovation. Our partnership reflects that principle in its evolution. The symposium continued throughout the afternoon, with breakout sessions exploring different aspects of their methodology. As evening approached, they found themselves alone together on the center's rooftop terrace. a space specifically designed to engage senses beyond the visual, with carefully calibrated acoustic properties, subtle temperature variations, and aromatic plantings that changed with the seasons. "A successful beginning, I think," Marcus observed as they sat together in the gathering dusk. "More than successful," Eleanor agreed. "The response exceeded even our optimistic projections." "Not just in numbers," Marcus clarified, "but in genuine engagement with the methodology, rather than mere curiosity about our personal story." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the distinction. Throughout their evolving partnership, they had navigated the public's interest in their unusual history, the secret mortgage payments, the rivalry-turned collaboration, the gradual deepening of their personal connection. That interest had sometimes threatened to overshadow the actual innovation of their design approach. "Though the personal story remains compelling," she noted with gentle humor. "Compelling but increasingly normalized," Marcus replied. "The narrative of our partnership has shifted from scandal to case study, from ethical controversy to professional model." "Is that how you see it?" Eleanor asked. "As a case study?" Marcus turned toward her, his expression softening. "Hardly. But I appreciate that the external perception has evolved, that what once seemed impossibly complicated now appears simply complex." The distinction captured something essential about their journey together, not the elimination of complexity, but its integration into a more complete understanding. The challenges remained, certainly. Their history couldn't be erased. Their different perspectives still occasionally created tension. The balance between individual identity and partnership required continuous negotiation. But what had once seemed like insurmountable obstacles had transformed into the very foundation of their strength. The authenticity that came from acknowledging complexity rather than denying it. The innovation that emerged from integrating different perceptual approaches. The trust built through navigating difficult terrain together. The New York Times review called the center a physical manifestation of "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Paul began, his manner more subdued than in previous interactions. "I wanted to speak with you before the symposium officially begins." "Of course," Eleanor responded neutrally. "What can we help you with?" Paul seemed to gather himself before continuing. "Primarily, I wanted to acknowledge the significance of what you've created, not just this center, but the methodology it represents. It's transforming how the field approaches inclusive design." "Thank you," Marcus acknowledged. "Though I suspect there's more to this conversation than professional recognition." Paul nodded, a brief smile acknowledging Marcus's perception. "Yes, I also wanted to address our personal history more directly than I've done previously." Eleanor studied her cousin, noting the changes 5 years had wrought, grey threading through his hair, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there, before a certain gravitas replacing the aggressive ambition that had once defined him. "My departure from the firm was unnecessarily destructive," Paul continued, "motivated as much by wounded pride as by genuine professional disagreement. The appropriation of your names, the client poaching, the leaked documents, all designed to inflict maximum damage." "We're aware of the intent," Eleanor said dryly. "The question is why revisit it now?" Paul leaned forward slightly. "Because this center represents something important, not just to the field, but to how we approach difference more broadly, and because its impact shouldn't be diminished by unresolved personal history." It was, Eleanor realized, as close to an apology as Paul's pride would allow. A recognition of the value they had created despite his efforts to undermine it. An acknowledgement that his actions had been disproportionate to whatever grievance he had felt. Marcus, seemingly sensing the same, nodded slightly. "Thank you for that perspective. The past is what it is, neither forgotten nor defining." "A characteristically balanced response," Paul observed with a small smile. "I've noticed that quality in your public discussions, the ability to acknowledge complexity without being paralyzed by it. A skill developed through necessity," Eleanor commented. "Our partnership hasn't exactly followed conventional paths." "No," Paul agreed, "which is perhaps what makes it valuable as a model, not despite the complications, but because of how you've navigated them." The conversation continued briefly, touching on professional matters and symposium logistics. As Paul prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, looking back at them, "what you've built together, professionally and personally, is remarkable. A genuine collaboration rather than mere association. I didn't understand the distinction when I appropriated your names years ago, but seeing the results of your actual partnership makes the difference clear." After he departed, Eleanor and Marcus remained in the conference room, both processing this unexpected closure to a chapter of their history that had once seemed irreparably divisive. "Well," Eleanor said finally, "that was surprising but not unwelcome," Marcus suggested. "Exactly that." She checked her watch. "We should head to the auditorium. The opening session begins in 20 minutes. As they made their way through the center, the building that represented both their design philosophy and their personal journey, Eleanor was struck by how completely their partnership had transformed from its complicated beginnings. What had started with secret mortgage payments had evolved through crisis, collaboration, and commitment into something neither could have anticipated, a genuine integration of their distinct perspectives into a shared vision that was changing their field. The main auditorium was nearly full when they arrived. Hundreds of professionals and students gathered to learn about the approach they had developed together. As Eleanor guided Marcus to the stage, she felt a moment of profound appreciation for the journey that had brought them to this point, not despite its complexities, but because of how those challenges had shaped their understanding of partnership, creativity, and connection. The symposium moderator introduced them with a summary of their contributions to the field, emphasizing how their collaborative methodology had transformed approaches to inclusive design. As they took their places at the center of the stage, the audience applauded enthusiastically. Eleanor began with an overview of the center's mission, explaining how it would serve as both educational institution and living laboratory, a space where diverse perspectives would continuously inform the evolution of design practice. Marcus followed with reflections on how their partnership had developed, from initial accommodation into genuine innovation, challenging assumptions about limitation and ability in the dialogue between different ways of experiencing the world, Eleanor remarked. "I think that describes our partnership as well as the building." "A dialogue that began with you secretly paying my mortgage," Marcus noted with a smile. "Hardly. The conventional foundation for architectural innovation. Or personal connection," Eleanor added softly. Marcus reached for her hand, finding it unerringly as he had learned to do over their years together. Yet here we are, 5 years into a partnership neither of us anticipated, creating work that matters in ways we couldn't have achieved separately. "Here we are," Eleanor echoed, squeezing his hand gently. Below them, the center continued to buzz with activity, students exploring the innovative spaces, professionals engaging with the methodology they had developed, a community forming around the approach they had pioneered together. The building itself stood as testimony to their journey, from rivalry to secret connection to genuine partnership, from individual achievement to shared vision, from limitation to possibility. It represented not an ending, but a new horizon, a foundation from which they would continue to explore, innovate, and evolve, both professionally and personally. The complexity remained, the challenges would continue, but they would face them as they had learned to do together, openly, and with the understanding that the most meaningful connections often emerge from the most complicated beginnings. As night settled around them, the center's thoughtfully designed lighting creating pools of illumination within the gathering darkness, Eleanor and Marcus remained on the terrace. Two architects who had found in each other not just professional complement but personal completion. Their partnership, like their buildings, engaged all senses, honored diverse perspectives, and created spaces where seemingly contradictory elements could coexist in harmony. It was, in every sense, a new horizon, not just for them, but for the field they had transformed through their unlikely, complicated, and ultimately profound connection. End of story.